Hello, hello, hello. Good morning, good evening, good day, good afternoon, and aloha. Welcome back to another episode of the Singularity Lab, your one-stop shop for reliable news and commentary on breaking stories in science and technology, futurism, and UAP discoveries. I am your co-host, Luis Jimenez. Joining me in a couple of minutes will be Michael and Kristen Mataluni, my esteemed colleagues. Today we will be speaking to the creator of Voices of VR podcast, Mr. Kent Bai. But before we bring them in, of course, I want to say hello to everyone in the chat. Thank you so damn much for being here. Looks like Anna and Morg are having a back and forth. I have no idea what's going on. I haven't read anything, but you guys are very active in the chat. Thank you so much for being here. Tina Tamazuski, thank you. She's now a moderator. I made her a moderator, Mike, by the way, on your channel, and I made her a moderator on my channel just because she's the best moderator I think I've ever seen. She's Creepy Pete's moderator, so please, Tina, don't feel as obligated to be here for these shows, because I know you kick so much ass on the Creepy Little Book, so I love that you're here. I hope your mom enjoyed the shout out from the dragon. By the way, Dragon's going to be on the show Wednesday. We're doing the last season episode review for it's The Secret of Skinwalker Ranch. I just talked to him today. We might have a pretty big guest coming on Wednesday, so stay tuned. Let's see here. We got Morg also here. Let's see, Aaron Desario. Hello, Aaron. Thank you for helping me earlier today with our little issue, Case for Infinity. Happy you are here. Rusty, what's shaking? G West. ABC CBA. I was trying to... Anyway, Anna, thank you guys. Please do us a favor, share, like, subscribe. Let everybody know what we're talking about here today. It's going to be a really fun show. Don't forget to check out our Patreons, you guys. We've got links in the description below. Both link trees. You can check out Mike's. Help support the channel. This is a public access channel. We are supported by viewers like you. So help our lives. Help us provide this content for you guys 5 days a week between two channels, Tuesday and Thursday here on the Singularity Lab, and Monday, Wednesday, and Friday over on my channel, The Unidentified Celebrity Review. So with all of that said, you guys, I think, Michael, how are we looking back there? You guys ready to rock this thing? Excellent. Let's do it, you guys. Let's bring in our host for the day, Mr. Michael Mataluni, and his lovely, lovely lady, Miss Kristen Mataluni. Mrs. Kristen Mataluni.
Mrs. Kristen Mataluni.
How you guys doing?
It's archaic bull. We don't really need it, do we?
Hey man, you tell me.
This female is no longer available for a reproductive device.
Is that what I said? If that's what I said, then no, absolutely not. We don't need any of it. But yeah, I mean, I'm a fan of the hierarchy. Nobody's a fan of the hierarchy anymore.
Oh yeah, well it's kind of the patriarchy, I think.
Or patriarchy, I mean.
Yeah, I think the patriarchy is out of esteem. So, you know, we don't need all this old school BS. We've got we're up to date, ladies and gentlemen. So, first of all, I want to welcome everyone. Thank you guys so much for joining us today. We've got an amazing show for you. We've got a truly extraordinary guest who has been on UCR several times, and he's one of our favorites. He's one of our esteemed colleagues as well. And I'm just super excited to have him here. So again, welcome everyone. In our first hour, we're going to be talking to Kent Bai and discussing the brain-computer interface technology and humanity's inevitable track toward a hive mind. In the second hour, we're going to be joined by Aaron Desario, Carl Vibe, Daniel Miller, and we've got a super duper surprise guest who I'm not going to share with you right now. Even Luis doesn't know. But first of all, Kent Bai, who is an American podcaster and experiential journalist based in Portland, Oregon. He is most known for his work in virtual reality, augmented reality, and artificial intelligence. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, Kent Bai.
Hey, thanks for having me back, and excited to dive into brain-computer interfaces and their relationship to VR. So yeah, excited to dive in.
Hell yeah.
Yeah, well, it's great to have you. And so maybe we could just kind of start with this, because I'm very curious. What specifically brought you to your interest in XR, VR, and brain-computer interface? Like, what led you into this realm?
Well, I first bought the Oculus Rift DK1 back on January 1st, 2014. And then it was just a really exciting, revolutionary technology, basically transport your consciousness into another virtual realm where you feel like you're actually there. And so it was a very exciting time in terms of like this, it felt like a home brew computer club revolution that was happening. And then Oculus got bought by Facebook there in 2014. And then in that May was when the first gathering happened at the Silicon Valley Virtual Reality Conference, where the first gathering of the modern resurgence of consumer VR. And I attended and ended up recording like 46 interviews and started the podcast. I was just very curious about the medium, just felt like really revolutionary in terms of what you could do with this virtual reality technology. And then so since then, over the last 7 years, I've gone to nearly 100 different events across the world, mostly on the West Coast of the United States. And I've recorded around 1,600 different oral history interviews, tracking the evolution of the medium. And I'm coming up actually on episode 1000 here within the next couple of weeks or so. But along the way, there's this, kind of neurotechnology fusion of virtual reality technologies allows you to kind of, feel like you're transported into another realm. And then with that, you have new ways of kind of tapping into the, potential of what's happening in your body, these physiological signals, and then finding ways to feed that back into virtual reality. So the first conference that I went to that was kind of BCI related was the Neuro Gaming Conference in 2016. And I met Connor Russomanno of the Open BCI project. That's the Open Brain Computer Interface. It was kind of like the equivalent of the Oculus Rift. It was like a kind of Kickstarter DIY kit where you could, have your own gear to basically do neuroscience research on yourself that, usually would cost thousands of dollars, was just for like a few $100s. And OpenBCI actually, ended up over the last 5 or 6 years, kind of spreading all of their DIY Arduino-driven kits out into all these different major tech firms. And as virtual and augmented reality have been coming up, then there's been this increased interest of how these types of neural interfaces, let's call them generally, whether it's using EMG, which is your muscles, or EEG, something you put on your head, but finding new ways of using these signals in your physiological metrics that are coming off your body to feed back into these immersive experiences. And that's kind of where a lot of these first applications are going to come, is in the context of these immersive environments. But there's also Elon Musk and Neuralink that's also doing much more invasive BCIs. So it kind of splits into two major areas: non-invasive and invasive. And most of my journalism and most of my coverage has been in the non-invasive realm. Although I have talked to different people who have done more invasive techniques. But Elon Musk is doing the more invasive route, which I'm, I guess, personally a little bit more skeptical about, just because I think from the people that I've talked to, the potential of how far you can take the non-invasive route is still so vast that we're just really at the cusp of kind of tapping into everything that you can do in the non-invasive route.
I'm excited to dig into both the invasive and the non-invasive. I'm curious, obviously you have a passion for the non-invasive and you're a little bit skeptical of the invasive. Can you tell us where your skepticism comes from for the invasive?
Well, you're putting a chip in your brain.
I was just going to make you say it.
It's brain surgery, right? Like how long does that last? Imagine buying a phone, right? And then having to use that phone for 50 years. It's like, this is something that's actually in your body. Right. Like, how do you upgrade it? Can you get hacked? And also, I think philosophically, there's these deeper limits in terms of like, we have a lot of theories of consciousness. And the predominant one is the neurological correlates of consciousness, meaning that, you functionally treat your brain as the entirety of your consciousness, right? But the most cutting edge neuroscience actually sees that your entire body is like a computer through what they call embodied cognition. So you actually are using your entire body to think. But when you just put a chip in your brain, then what are you doing in terms of is that able to actually kind of either stimulate your brain? There's another area I should mention is the reading of information to your brain and the writing of information directly to your brain. So the reading is much more advanced, right? So like that is something that a lot of neuroscience is able to start to decode different aspects of what's happening in your brain. Everything from like decoding your thoughts. but just tracking your visual attention and whatnot. But to actually write information to your brain, that's also where I'm more skeptical, just because we have our sensory modalities of our eyeballs and all our sensory experience, and that all kind of gets fused into our consciousness in some mysterious way that we still don't fully understand. And so you're basically talking about kind of hacking, directly into that with something that we don't really already understand already, but also like our direct phenomenal experiences. There's so much that you can do with, like, say, the virtual reality, simulacrum, rather than trying to write directly. So I guess that's where my skepticism comes in, is like there's a lot of assumptions that we're making, and we will find out. I mean, like, there's a lot of open philosophical questions around the philosophy of mind, and so it could actually be like the Daniel Dennett, everything is just sort of like a consciousness and illusion, and it's all just like the neurons firing in the brain. Or we may find out that consciousness is a fundamental field, that our brain is functionally more like an antenna than it is where that's like the seat of consciousness, right? So it'd be kind of like the equivalent of you cracking open your TV set, trying to look for the source code of the Game of Thrones that you're streaming from HBO. You're not finding it because it's streaming from HBO on a server, and you're receiving it. So that's sort of like a metaphor for the difference between whether or not consciousness is an emergent phenomenon from our brain, or if it's something that is more of a fundamental field that could have non-local qualities that we don't fully quite understand. So given that that's an open philosophical question, to basically commit yourself to putting technology in your brain, I feel like it's going to start with people who have neurodegenerative diseases, who actually need it directly to sort of improve their life. And the point at which it becomes electional surgery is so far away anyway. And by that time, I feel like what Facebook Reality Labs and other virtual reality companies have been doing is like really tapping into the potential of what you could do with non-invasive techniques. I mean, Control Labs, they have this thing you put on your wrist, and it's able to potentially isolate down to the firing of an individual single motor neuron, which means that they're able to basically, like, everybody's sort of motor neuron develops uniquely, and that they're able to basically detect that through artificial intelligence and be able to isolate that down to the firing of a single motor neuron. That means that you could put this thing on your wrist and you could just think about moving, and you don't even have to move. And just the thought of moving, having that thought of moving, so that gets sent to that motor neuron, and that could be enough to sort of activate it. So you're essentially creating these ways of interfacing into these immersive technologies by putting this called the EMG, it's electromyography, which is detecting the muscle firings. So I guess a lot of, like, when I talk to neuroscientists, the embodied cognition is all about the motor cortex. The motor cortex is how your body is moving, right? And so the movements of your bodies is a lot different than, say, trying to decode your thoughts, which is, what you would typically think of, like these brain-computer interfaces that are kind of decoding the brain.
Or encoding your brain, right? I mean, that's what you're talking about, the whole writing of downloading software directly, literally writing to the brain. It's really interesting because you bring up these two very different theories about consciousness, about human consciousness. One is, are we simply the product of the computations, the neurons firing in our brain? Is that what consciousness is? Or are we decoding a greater mystery? Where do you lie on that spectrum personally?
Well, I went to the American Philosophical Association in 2019 and interviewed a number of different philosophers of the mind. And, where they come down to it is that, there's no way to know for sure. So there's like all these possible solutions, whether that's panpsychism or the, reductive materialistic kind of, eliminative materialism is what the Daniel Dennett branches, that, consciousness is all just illusion. It's all just the neurons firing and the neurological correlates. And then there's like, I've talked to Bernardo Kastrup, who has like the theory of idealism, which is like the universal mind, which just, there's a talk by David Chalmers, a TED talk, that talks about the fundamental debates about the philosophy of mind as to whether or not consciousness is an emergent epiphenomena or whether or not it's a universal field that we're tapping into. And so there's no way to test it, right? So we may find out, given all the advances of neuroscience, that the neurological correlates of consciousness theory is correct. And that, all of the dreams that Elon Musk has is sort of based upon a lot of that, assumption. But that may not actually prove out. It may be that there's more mysteries of the consciousness that we don't fully understand yet. these different anomalies that people report. So for me, I'm more of a fan of, say, like the panpsychist view, which is that, well, either way, you either start with physical, concrete, stuff like the physicalist, and you have to get consciousness out of something that doesn't have consciousness, or you say that there's maybe a little bit of consciousness in every little bit of matter, and that it sort of pools together in some way, and that's sort of more of a panpsychist view. And when I talk to the philosophers of mind, panpsychism is an approach that I think has a lot more steam, just because there's so many philosophical the hard problem of consciousness is what David Chalmers talks about. So for me, that's where I lean, but I have to philosophically looking at it, keep all of the options on the table until we have more data and more information. And I think that's part of what's exciting about virtual and augmented reality and these BCIs is that we're going to find out, like in a lot of ways, the kind of transhumanist folks who want to be the first in line to be able to put technology into their body, to kind of see how that's going to be able to augment their experiences. I'm not on that. I'm not in the first line of that. I'm like, wait and see, and use the non-invasive and really take that to its limits. But encourage people the freedom to be able to experiment, because they may actually figure something out. But you have these things in your brain, and it's all connected by Bluetooth. So it's not, Bluetooth isn't exactly the most secure way of transferring.
Well, I could say though, the part about an invasive sort of method is it looks cool. It's a cyberpunk reality, where if you could replace your eyeballs with better vision, like the Predator or something. But yeah, no, I see what you're saying. I mean, I feel like even with when you buy a car, let's say you bought a car in 2005 that had the navigation full package system. In 2021, that navigation system is terrible. I could not imagine if you had that in your body. But here was an interesting question, $5 donation. If two brain chips are talking, can you lie to each other?
Well, so I want to sort of bring in another concept, because there's a concept called sensory substitution or sensory replacement by David Eagleman. I think this is important because I think it's very instructive as to what this may actually end up being like. So when I went to one of the neurogaming, it went from neurogaming to X technology, partly because these brain-computer interfaces, they really want to have them in the game context, but they're really not able to push a button consistently. They don't work well in a way of, say, have a thought and have it take an action immediately, like in a video game context. They're much better of, say, if you're meditating and you're listening as a rolling average, you're able to sort of see a certain characteristics of what's happening in your body. So there was a little bit of a rebranding from neurogaming to X tech that happened because of what these technologies are really good at, is seeing kind of more of these rolling averages and more of the medical context rather than, say, the gaming context. But I was talking to a neuroscientist named David Eagleman, and he has this neurosensory vest. And so this vest was like this haptic vest that was able to take audio and then break it down into different frequencies and then translate that into sort of vibrations on your chest. And he was able to basically recreate the sounds that he was hearing from the microphone and send that same signal up into his brain, right? And so essentially what you're able to do is people who are deaf are able to train themselves to hear by seeing, by taking all this sensory information. Your brain just kind of is a pattern recognizing machine. And so it's able to kind of make sense of the correlations. And then from that, you're able to kind of turn your torso into an ear, right? So it's this concept of taking one sense and being able to send information into your body and translate that into another sense. That to me is just like a mind-blowing concept. But is it hearing in the same way that we hear? Right. Is it sort of is it in the part of the phenomenal consciousness? And the way that David Eagleman described it to me is that it's sort of like an unconscious thing your body's learning to do, right? So that you're kind of figuring it out, and it's almost like learning a language, but you kind of have to do it step by step. And there's some point where your brain just kind of is able to synthesize it and make sense of it. So imagine being able to make sense of it, but it being below a level of conscious awareness, right? So I suspect,
and then try to explain it to somebody else.
Right. Well, there's certain ways in which there's a lot of different layers of filtering that happen through our perceptual systems, right? And so there's things that are below our conscious awareness, and so it's referred to as sort of the sub-symbolic processing. There's ways that we are making sense of the world, but we can't put language on it because it's below our threshold of even being able to describe. So when you talk about some of these brain control interfaces, I suspect it's going to be kind of like that, where you'd be like injecting stuff past all the filters directly into your brain. Well, does it get into your phenomenal consciousness like other things? Or is it just sort of like you have somebody who's maybe feeding you secret messages that you can't really articulate because it's just, going directly into your bones, metaphorically.
Right.
So I guess that's a good metaphor that I also think about. That's why I'm a little bit more skeptical about the a lot of the things that I've seen, at least with the monkey controlling things, is all about like, sending out thoughts to be able to control your motor cortex. When you start to get into like your thoughts and your ideas and your brain, that's a whole other layers of your frontal cortex that is higher level. That's what when I talk to Connor Rusomano, he talks about the difference between brain control interfaces and mind control interfaces. And what we really want is that sort of mind control where we're able to kind of decode everything that's happening in the brain, including our acoustic thoughts, our images, our thoughts, our dreams. That's eventually like we can. When I went to a recent conference called the Non-Invasive Neural Interfaces Conference, and there's different experts that were talking about, okay, here's what we can do, here's what we can't do. And they're saying anything that's in the working memory, we can basically decode. So if you recall the memory and it's in your working memory, then you could sort of potentially decode it. But decoding
when you say working memory, what do you mean by that? Is this like the RAM of your, okay.
Essentially like the RAM, like when you recall a memory, if I say, remember the time when you drink your first cup of coffee, right? That's a memory that I'm invoking, and you're remembering where you were when you drank your first cup of coffee, right?
Okay.
But before I said that, it wasn't in your working memory, and that's like very difficult for like to be decoded from a neuroscience perspective.
Oh, got it. Okay, so it's much easier to decode things that are in your working memory than it is to go in deeper into the brain and actually find that memory.
Right. Like decoding memories is something that hasn't, like they don't know how memories have been encoded. That's sort of part of the mysteries of consciousness. And it could be that it's just like this 11-dimensional matrix and they just don't have enough resolution or enough processing power or enough AI to be able to do that. We may be able to do that. We may never be able to do that. I mean, it could be that our brain is like some sort of non-local antenna that's able to, store things out into higher dimensions. I mean, there's a lot of things about actually trying to decode different aspects of the brain that we don't fully understand yet. And, it's to be seen as to how far it's going to be able to be taken. But when I went to this non-invasive neural interfaces ethical considerations conference, there's basically all these neuroscientists saying, here's what we can do, here's what we can't do. And here are the ethical implications given that, that we have to think about. When you start to have technology that can start to kind of metaphorically read your mind, then what are the implications of what happens to that data? And how do we navigate this world that our rights to mental privacy are all of a sudden threatened because we have these machines that are operating within this context? So that's a lot about what that was talking about. But they were talking about, okay, here's what we can do, here's what we can't do. And that was based upon, me hearing from those neuroscientists and also going to the future of neuroscience and VR from the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research. I was invited to go to this kind of private conference with all these neuroscientists that were funded from Canada and the United States. And again, talking about here's what we can do. And probably the most wild thing that I saw there was some research from UCSF where it's called speech synthesis, where they can basically, you can think a thought, and then it takes the motor cortex of how you would move your tongue as you're thinking that, and then that's able to basically output that and turn that into an audio file, right? Wow. So it's like, but a lot of that is from an invasive ECOG. So it's something where people have had this neural lace on high, directly into their brain, and it's something that's an invasive technique. So a lot of these types of like decoding the brain, I've been using these invasive techniques, but what was told to me at this conference was that over time, they're going to be able to develop artificial, as they understand how the brain works by putting these sensors on it, then they're able to do the non-invasive technique where they don't have to, put this neural lace onto your brain, but they'll be able to basically decode it from all the, and eliminate all the noise to be able to get that high signal so that they're able to essentially do some of the same things that they could only do with these invasive techniques with the non-invasive techniques. That's why I'm more of a fan of the non-invasive techniques, just because over time, it could just prove out that given enough sort of artificial intelligence and the right signals, and as you fuse everything together, you may be able to, do some of the things that you weren't able to do, or that you could only do if you were to put a chip in.
But it does seem to me like the invasive is going to give the data. It's going to gather more data more quickly for the non-invasive developments over time. I was talking to a buddy of mine recently who's a psychotherapist, and one of the things that I brought up to him was Elon Musk and Neuralink, and this idea of being able to map the brain, right, going in invasively and being able to begin to decode the mystery that is the brain. And he's like, bullshit. He's like, there's no way you're ever going to be able to use this to map the brain. There's too much epigenetic and too much genetic going on that you can't find enough. And I was like, well, what about quantum computing and AI? All we just need to do is extract this data, and then we'll be able to decode it with these deep minds. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, when I hear the neuroscientists talk about this, they say that it's a brain measurement problem, meaning that you're limited by the resolution that you have, right? So if you do have an invasive technique, then you're still having, they have like 80 billion neurons or something like that. So, and they're all kind of working together in a holistic way. So you can only measure a certain part of it. So then you're trying to extrapolate information based upon like a partial insight as to how everything's kind of working together. Ideally, you'd be able to put like a sensor on every single neuron and you'd be able to like figure it out. But that's something that we can't do. So you have to have these different trade-offs, from spatial resolution and accuracy. And, there's even within the non-invasive technique, you have these trade-offs between comfort and, the resolution. So, if you want to have as many different nodes as you possibly can directly connected to it, but then that could potentially mean that you have all this gel that you have to put on and, all these different sensors, it's like really cumbersome to put this thing on with like, 80 or 120 or whatever, 64 different, sensors.
While living your actual life, so you can actually give good data back to the machine.
Right. So then there's this trade-off. Like the Muse headband only has like a couple of different, but it's a lot lower resolution. You can only do a certain limited amount of stuff with it. So it's much more focused about what you can and cannot do. And so what I've seen happen is from OpenBCI, they were doing kind of like the open source approach, and then they got in touch with Valve. Valve is like one of the biggest game development companies, and they have the Valve Index and they have the Steam VR. They've been one of the big innovators within virtual reality, and they then teamed up with Tobii eye tracking. So they're working on a thing called Project Galea, which is it's a virtual reality headset that has the OpenBCI integrated with all these different sensors, not just the EEG, but the PPV. So it's measuring blood flow to be able to look at your heart rate variability. It's able to look at EMG, the muscle sensors in your face to be able to detect emotions. The EOC, which is the interocular, which is you have like polarities as you look left and right or up and down. You can detect what general direction you're looking at. And then on top of that, eye tracking and the pupil dilation. I mean, as you add all these things together, you're able to potentially get this bit of information from this sensor, this bit of information from this sensor. The whole idea is to start to do this sensor fusion and tying all these things together and seeing these different correlations. And that's the sort of the frontiers of neuroscience right now, is as you do this sensor fusion within the context of these virtual reality technologies, then they're able to understand more about the brain, but also be able to take maybe pieces of information and other physiological signatures and be able to tie them together and use them in context. For Valve, they want to be able to like measure your sense of stress that you have in a game, and whether or not you're lying or not, is one of the things they have in their patent. And so
whether or not you're lying?
Yes.
In what context?
Well, again, this is sort of a controversial thing, I'd say, in terms of like, the degree to which that you could take these physiological signatures and detect deception, deception detection and lie detector test. I mean, this is something that even, polygraph tests have lots of different controversial research around in the limited, how they can be hacked, or they have limited efficacy. They're not like a perfect lie detector. There's no perfect way. But that's the type of thing that Valve has had in their patent, is to sort of take these different physiological reactions and then be able to like change the gameplay of the immersive experience that you're in real time, so that it's a much more immersive experience, right? So if you're in a horror experience and you get just a little bit scared, then maybe they would do something in the environment that you get you even more scared. So it's stuff like that where they're trying to do this kind of real-time closed loop systems. And that's the type of thing that I see, from Valve doing in the gaming context. And there's all sorts of movements of, say, the consciousness hacking movement, which is the whole other thing of people using this type of real-time biometric feedback to be able to hack their consciousness, whether it's meditation or, doing specific, getting them direct brain stimulation. Like I said, most of the stuff that I've looked at is the reading information, but there's also like ways of stimulating your brain externally and internally, to kind of try to activate different things. And so that's a whole other thing that some folks have been experimenting with. And there's some therapeutic aspects of that that have been used. But when you think about like hacking your consciousness and being able to invoke different states of consciousness, then whether it's like looking at blinking lights or measuring what's happening with your heart rate variability, which HeartMath was an innovator when it comes to looking at your heart rate and being able to detect your kind of coherence when it comes to different brainwave frequencies. So all these, there's a whole movement of consciousness hacking that are using these types of brain-computer interfaces and virtual reality to be able to kind of create these artificially induced altered states of consciousness. And I went to a whole conference that was looking at the intersection between psychedelics, these kind of meditative spiritual practices, and immersive technologies like the brain-computer interfaces and virtual reality technologies, and sort of fusing all these together. So it's sort of like this interesting intersection that I see happening, which is people from these different disciplines kind of combining all these different things together and seeing what you can do when you add all these things together.
Holy shit, I have like 12 million questions. I guess my first question would be like, so my son and I, we went to, I think it was Dave & Buster's or something, and we did a VR experience, and it was one of these horror experiences, and it was terrifying.
I thought you were going to say you got a Neuralink at Dave & Buster's. I was like, I don't know if I keep that. Yeah. No, how many tickets did that cost, the Neuralink?
Yeah. This was not invasive VR, but it was so terrifying. Like it was, I mean, these things were coming out of the nowhere. They were coming from behind you. You had to like turn and shoot, and it was really scary. But one of the things that I found so interesting, Kent, that you were talking about is this closed loop scenario, this feedback loop. So you're getting, in the future, we'll have much better haptics, so it can measure my body wavelengths. It'll understand my stress hormones and all of these things, so that they can measure basically how afraid I am, and then up the fear or down the fear literally in the game while you're playing it. Is that something that you see coming down the pike pretty quick?
Oh, yeah. I mean, the first virtual reality big game that Valve created was Half-Life Alyx, and it's kind of like a horror game. And so, you can imagine as they add the whole brain-computer interface, trying to take those types of real-time physiological reactions, galvanic skin response, your temperature, when you add all these things together, they're trying to essentially kind of check out what I would categorize into 4 different major qualities of presence, your active presence, your mental and social presence, your emotional presence, and your embodied presence and environmental presence. So like if we break that down, your active presence are all your actions and behaviors and ways that you're expressing agency within the experience. And so in these environments, they're going to be able to track your behaviors and be able to kind of extrapolate what your intentions are to what Facebook calls contextually aware AI, to see what your full context is and trying to understand your environment, but also how you're moving and how you're acting in that context and how you're moving around and how you're acting. And then the mental and social presence, that's where you get into a lot more of, the social presence would be, communicating with other people. So when you talk about like communication with people, there's a lot of our kind of nonverbal communication when it comes to our body language that we're communicating. But what if, you're in a virtual reality environment and you start to broadcast your physiological signals with someone in a virtual environment and they're being represented in a way? It'd almost be like what we were talking about earlier, like a truth test, like if you see somebody's heart rate, go up or whatnot, there could be ways in which that, in order to be really true and authentic in these environments, that could be a way that people are consenting to do this in order to create additional intimacy. I was talking to some people from Subpack, and Subpack is like a haptic vest that has, kind of takes low frequencies and puts it like, it makes it feel like you're actually at like a concert where you feel like the bass hitting your body. And that's what Subpack essentially does. And they were saying that they kind of did this consciousness hacking where they were sharing each other's heartbeat with each other, where they were with each other and they were like synchronizing their heartbeats by wearing Subpacks. So again, that's a way that you can sort of create synchrony and this deep level of intimacy with somebody. But the mental presence, is all the stuff around your cognitive load, but also your thoughts and all the things that's happening inside of your mind. So that could be, that's part of the 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now, being able to decode higher level cognitive thing, moving from brain control interfaces to the mind control interfaces or the mind machine interfaces, where it's able to actually decode your thoughts and maybe look at your imagination and translate your imagination in real time into like a depiction in a virtual world. But the emotion, there's different aspects of your emotional presence. And so to the degree that, the galvanic stim response and having sweat, those are kind of looking at different proxies for emotional intensity. Emotions is something that is really complicated to try to, like, you really need a lot of different sensors and a lot of different pieces of information, but that's one other degree in terms of trying to detect what emotional reaction you're having at any moment. And then the final one is your sense of embodied presence. That would be everything from your muscle tensions and your sensory experience in general, and your attention, what you're paying attention to, and everything else. So all of these sensors are kind of tracking all of these different, let's call them biometrically inferred psychography, or your computed data, or all this information that's trying to sort of create these proxies of what's happening inside of your body, and that each of these sensors are trying. Each of, I guess, from a perspective of like Valve, they want to create that into a video game. Someone like Adam Ghazali is more looking at these medical applications, and so actually there's a whole movement within the FDA to be able to take virtual reality experiences and actually treat them as medicine for certain conditions like autism or other things. So there's actually a whole new movement called digital therapeutics that are whole, like, rather than being prescribed a drug, you're prescribed a virtual experience, and that's starting to be approved by the FDA now. So you have this whole.
They
movement.
used to just say you need a vacation. Now you're going to get a VR vacation.
Well, and for learning disabilities too, like all the therapy I went to, they could change that over into like VR that you do for like an hour a day.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Visual spatial work and what? Yeah.
Yeah. So some of the more medical applications, things like that, would be like there's a whole pod, a sensory immersion pod that Adam Ghazali from UCSF has like created as one of his startups. And you basically, it's like detecting all these different physiological markers. It's, giving you, haptic, it's like basically the Ready Player One, had your haptic vest and all this other information. But this is more in the context of like, in a luxury hotel where you go and maybe have like a relaxing, experience. I saw that the Army, and there's just different ways that some of these different technologies are already in the Army in terms of, ways to them kind of do mental training or, relaxation or different stuff like that. So there's these types of virtual reality and immersive technologies and brain control interfaces are being used to kind of help train soldiers in different contexts as well.
What was that, Kristen?
I was like, or the dentist. Like, one of the main reasons I go to my dentist is because they put up a big screen with like drone photography of foreign countries that you can watch and you're not so stressed out. So VR would be really good.
For relaxation, yeah. Yeah, for sure. This idea of Ready Player One that you brought up, and this kind of idea of a metaverse, how far off do you think we are from this concept? For those of you who don't know, a metaverse is basically an entire digital world that you can literally live in. What are you thinking? Because I know, you think about the major industries and the major players who are going to be leveraging VR, right? It's going to be video games. It's going to be probably the porn industry. I imagine that's going to be one of the leaders out there. What are your thoughts, Kent, when it comes to which industries are going to be leading the charge?
Wait a second. You think the two leading industries are going to be porn and video games?
Absolutely. Kent, this is my suspicion. Now I want to hear if that's accurate.
That's so funny.
If you think I'm accurate, Kent.
I thought for sure you would have went medical, but let's see what Kent's got to say.
I think historically it's been true that porn has been an innovator in technology, but that has not been true with VR. The innovator has been gaming. And you can just look at, gaming has come first. There certainly is like different porn applications, but I'd say, by and far, there's other more compelling sort of use cases in terms of drivers of the technology adoption. Training in VR is one of the things that has come up. and also like medical applications. I mean, there's lots of different contexts. I mean, you asked about the metaverse, and we'll get to that, but there's lots of different sort of like the ultimate potential of XR. It has everything from entertainment and storytelling and medical applications and ways that you're kind of interfacing and going on dates with your romantic partner, or going into dealing with death or grieving, and higher education and training and travel and working for your career and productivity. And eventually all these things are going to be replaced. All the screens that we have now replaced with like sort of like virtual reality or augmented reality. When I say all, there's always no technology is ever completely eliminated, but you sort of add on to, imagine everything that you're looking at like a small phone screen, and it'd be a fully immersive screen in the future. So we're kind of moving into a world where we may have like that type of productivity. You also have like remote work, people being able to work from home. You have hanging out with friends and being able to kind of, go out and just, play games with them. People who have accessibility issues, the technology being able to extend their existing senses. But you also have expressions of your own identity, ways that you can, become like a furry or an animal or whatever you want to become.
Avatar.
Non-humanoid representations. You have the exchange of virtual goods in terms of these whole new virtual economy, and moving more from tangible objects into like experiences and these virtual mediated experiences, but also like early education, higher education, and just communication in general, and being able to connect to your home and family. So that's just sort of like a quick tour through all the different contexts and domains. So VR is really going to be just like the internet, kind of spread out across all these different domains. And moving from a 2D to a 3D is a whole paradigm shift. And the metaverse is a different, I think it's something we have a concept of what that might mean from science fiction, but there's not like a universally agreed upon definition for what that is. And it's one of those things that companies will end up throwing it around as a marketing term. One thing that I like to think of at least is that you have kind of like this interoperability that you have on the internet. Like when you go to a website, you can click on a link and go to another website, right? So the idea would be that, translating that sort of metaphor into like these virtual spaces where you could be hanging out with a friend, and then all of a sudden you're going out and you're going into another world, be kind of going from one website to another. So to some degree, there's a lot of which that the metaverse is already here. It's just in 2D and it's in the internet, right? But then, to what degree is the bar that you're setting to say that now we've achieved this kind of collective agreed upon definition of what we consider to be the metaverse? And I think generally what I would say is like there has to be some sort of interoperability. It can't be just a bunch of closed walled gardens. I mean, that I don't think that's the vision of what we imagined, kind of like a Disney World or the AOL or CompuServe of these immersive experiences that you really want to be able to go between all these different, but also be able to take certain parts of your identity and parts of your digital goods between these. So there's a lot of these different aspects that are actually being defined right now by like things like the Kronos Group is one of the standards organizations, but as well as the Open Metaverse Interoperability Group. They're trying to define what are the kind of the basic standards that we need to make in order to kind of go into the metaverse. Because most of the metaverse at this point has been bootstrapped on these closed walled garden proprietary systems like the Unity game engine or the Unreal Engine. But there is open standards like WebXR, where a lot of this kind of like vision of the interoperable metaverse, I think, is going to most likely start to come into place. So you have all these open standards that are kind of built up, OpenXR, WebXR, amazing different collaboration amongst all these different tech companies. And that's going to like form the foundation of what I would consider to be the metaverse. But again,
I hadn't even considered that.
Missions.
I hadn't even considered that. I always just kind of thought when you think of, when you watch a sci-fi like or read Ready Player One or something like that, you just kind of assume that this is one build from one company and just they've created this enormous universe. But you're kind of talking about it on a level like the internet. You want to be able to move throughout without being locked into any particular company or business model. Is that kind of what they're trying to define?
Yeah, what the depiction of the Oasis is owned by one company, and that's sort of like a dystopic hell that we want to avoid at all costs.
Right.
Because why would we want one company controlling something like that? I mean, it's too big to be controlled by one company. And I think there's a lot of ways in which that science fiction can become like a roadmap where people strive to actually do that, and that actually is embedded into people trying to own the metaverse. I think anytime you try to own the metaverse, that's you're going down a path where it's kind of like you're becoming the IOI of, Ready Player One, the villain of, trying to sort of, just own and control everything. I think when I talked to Tim Sweeney a number of years ago, he's the founder of Epic Games, and he said, a lot of this, science fiction literature of the metaverse was written before all the modern resurgence of video games and consoles, So there's probably a lot of ways in which that you could look at, something like Fortnite is kind of creating its own little metaverse. And to what degree can you kind of like have economies that are certainly within Fortnite, but can you expand that out beyond just the bubble of Fortnite? And I think that's sort of.
I think you can. It's they've done that with what's the game I'm thinking of? It's one of these role playing games where it instead of putting in the time to get the currency within the game, you can pay real money to get somebody to get you to that point in the game where you want to start off. So in a way, it's transcended that little universe and now is in real world territory.
Yeah.
And not to mention the the things probably 10 years ago when these little microtransactions started to really take off in video games, where you started to use real world money to buy in-world armor and different things like that. You can only imagine what it's going to look like. This entire conversation, I'm just trying to figure out what to invest in to capitalize on this.
Yeah, you ain't, dude. That ain't happening. But I was going to say, like, even in like Grand Theft Auto 5, they have their own in-world currency in there. And when hackers hack the system and start dumping money into the game, it inflates the currency, and that's why they have to get rid of these hackers that do it. So I think it's very interesting. But Kent, where do you see, because right now these Google glasses are super cumbersome, right? They're still not the funnest thing to wear. So how quickly do you see the hardware side of this improving, and where do you see this headset maybe evolving into, as opposed to this clunky piece of hardware?
Have you tried an Oculus Quest yet? I'm just curious.
I haven't. I have tried the Oculus Rift.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
So the Oculus Quest, I think, is really, in terms, obviously over time, the form factor is going to come down, and it's going to be like, these glasses are going to be able to do both VR and AR. But right now, you're really kind of limited by the thermals, and you need to have it like a battery and everything. And, you're driving LCD screens and you don't have any wires. It's all wireless. And so I think actually a lot of what the Oculus Quest 1 and Quest 2 is actually, kind of having a Quest or having the Oculus Rift with having like a $1,500 piece, $1,500 to $2,000 PC that's, PC that can run these experiences. That was a big barrier, but once the Oculus...
I think that's why our son returned his. He realized that his system couldn't do what it needed to make it flow correctly, and he said it made him dizzy. And,
it was super choppy, he said.
Yeah, you need to be able to hit like a frame rate, otherwise it can make you motion sick. But it's kind of like in normal video game, speak, you have like different classes of games. So you have the mobile games, you have the console games, you have PC games, and you have like arcade games. We don't really have much arcades, but overseas there's a lot more arcades. So just the same, there's kind of like, there's still like the PC VR, but there's the mobile phones that you used to have mobile phones that you put in, but that people's batteries for their phones, they don't want to put it and kind of drain their batteries. So that kind of went away as an option. And it kind of moved more towards the kind of the hybrid of the PSVR is like a console, but the Oculus Quest is kind of like a console, but it's more of like a mobile. It's kind of like a hybrid. It's kind of like it's equivalent of what the mobile VR is now, and the console version of like the PSVR. And then the arcade would be like the location-based experiences that you have all this kind of fancy haptic experiences that would be way too expensive for one person to own. So you tend to see a lot more of that. But with the pandemic, a lot of the location-based entertainment places, like the Void, went out of business, and some of them
they're very real experiences. In other words, the experience doesn't change, because every time you change the virtual experience, you have to go in and change the room, the actual where the walls are and where people can and what people can touch, because it's not as once you write the program for the game, that's it. Like you can't go in because the cost would be insane to change the experience every time. So if you do it once, that's it. You can't go back and get a different experience the second time, which is I think why it failed.
Well, no, I think the Void actually had a modular system to be able to kind of accommodate that, where they're able to kind of have a certain physical limits to their architecture, but still have design patterns to be able to create an infinite number of different kind of experiences. I mean,
okay.
It was more of other licensing issues and other things. I mean, I don't know that full story for why they failed hasn't fully been told, but I think part of it could be the pandemic in the end of it.
Yeah.
But yeah, the location-based entertainment aside, there is a bit of a technology progression where something that does start in arcades can eventually get, down to the consumer market. So I think that's kind of where we're at right now, is that we're kind of like trying to get to the point where it's just easy for people to use. And I think the Oculus Quest has actually achieved that. So the virtual reality technologies, it kind of, you have this diffusion out from what Rogers calls the Rogers diffusion curve, where you have like the innovators, the early adopters, and it crosses the chasm into the mainstream with the early majority. And we're kind of making that jump right now from the point where it's still kind of like in this like early adopter, but within the next couple of years, it's going to like move into like going mainstream and going viral in the sense where, from like a doubling each year, you go from 1 million to 2 million to 4 million, then 8 to 16 to 32. It's just sort of like it takes off where, all of a sudden, you have 2 or 3 friends that are in VR and you're like, oh, now it's worth me, getting to hang out with them. So I think that's where we're kind of at. But Facebook is kind of dominating the market when it comes to the standalone VR headsets, and so that's a little worrisome because there's not a lot of competition, and they're kind of creating a situation of, there's the lawsuit that was from Epic Games from Apple, and what Tim Sweeney was really trying to do is say, basically Apple has this tax of like 30% of any commerce that happens on their platform, you have to pay this 30% tax. So imagine if you go back in time,
like here on Google,
if like Tim Berners-Lee or Vint Cerf were to put that same tax, that would like put a 30% tax to anything you bought on Amazon.com would go to like one person. That's kind of the equivalent of what we have with this new kind of cell phone technology, but also immersive technology, is that we're kind of potentially living into a future where a small handful of corporations are going to own, this technology and have the right to tax people like these 30% taxes for the rest of, unless we have sort of like the whole open hardware movement, that's sort of a countervailing force that goes beyond just having everything in these closed, well-guarded proprietary systems. So
is that something that you see happening? I mean, obviously, Facebook's already done this once, right? They've already done it to us once, and we're all pissed off about it, but none of us do anything about it. We just deal with it. Are they going to do the same thing with VR? And to your point, there are open hardware movements happening. Do you see this as having any momentum that could be an actual competitor to Facebook?
Well, there's like headsets like the Lynx just announced within the last week or so. So there are some out there, but there was open source VR, OS VR, and it always kind of sucked. The unfortunate thing is that in order to develop these technologies, it takes an enormous amount of capital
investment.
Magic Leap was one of the companies that really try to make a go of being an independent XR hardware company using their augmented reality device, but they had a lot of hype, but then they weren't able to actually kind of deliver on that. But also, it takes an enormous amount of money. So Facebook has seen this as an opportunity to potentially invest in this technology because they got left behind in the mobile. They don't have their own cell phone, so because of that, they're kind of creating their own. They're investing billions and billions and billions of dollars, and they're making a lot of innovations. And it is all very exciting, but it's also a little concerning when you only see one major company out there and the other companies kind of lagging behind, especially if you see this as a trend that starts to take off. Are we going to have another duopoly like we have on the cell phones between Android versus iOS? Is it going to be like the Apple version versus Facebook version, and those are your two options? Or are we going to have third options, or are we going to have like completely different options? So I think that's like, given from how the cell phone market has played out, it's not too optimistic as to how it's going to play out in the XR industry, unless there's like a widespread movement where people decide to pay more money to get a worse experience just to support like these third-party players. But I think that's kind of where we're at right now. Is just the amount of money it takes to be a big player in these means that you're kind of like the amount of influence these tech companies have, they're going to only have that much more influence in the future.
Do you see? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Lou.
No, I was going to say, wouldn't it be advantageous of, say, whoever wants to sort of corner the market on something like that? Wouldn't it be advantageous now, especially since the technology is getting cheaper, to just start giving them away with subscriptions? Like that's sort of the idea that I thought was going to start happening with cable companies, because my friends were talking about, this idea of meeting your friends from all around the country at the 50-yard line of your favorite football team. And you guys could sit in this virtual room and you could have a conversation, you could drink beers together, and it's almost as good as, hanging out with your buddies in a living room. And this idea that when you're in the stadium and you're looking at, the billboards and the scoreboards, all of these things are going to be catered to what you're searching online. So if it's these advertisements will be catered to where you're looking and what your search history and browser history has been looking before the game. And so if you've got a cat, you need cat food. Boom, you get a Purina ad on the scoreboard inside the stadium, but your buddy next to you maybe gets an ad for Trojan condoms, because he's a hound dog.
And imagine theme parks with no lines and no weather.
Right.
Ooh, that's tempting, but like this idea, like I feel like it would be, if I was Facebook and I was trying to start a virtual, movement, I would be giving these things out for free and saying, hey, come, like almost like Netflix did. Like Netflix was like, hey, you can get any movie you want when you want for $5 a month. And now all of a sudden we're at $15 a month, $17 a month. And it's a completely different service, and people have just accepted it.
Well, that's the Facebook model too. We'll give you this for free. Just know that you are the product. You're signing away your rights to have any sort of control over your personal data. And now those things are changing. Facebook is updating their model because they're being forced to by Apple. Right. And, they're working on eliminating the breaches. But my goodness, think about the ability to advertise. To your point, Lou, give it to them for free. This is this is the Facebook model. This is the drug dealer model. This is,
it's a good model. It's kind of what we do here. We give you a show for free 5 days a week, but we ask you to please donate. Check out the links below.
The Oculus Quest 2s are actually already subsidized. I mean, they're $300.
They're so cheap. Yeah.
They would cost like probably $500 or $600 if you were to actually.
And they're subsidized based on what?
Well, it's sort of Facebook wanting to sort of own the market, so they're willing to kind of have the loss leader to be able to grow it to a certain phase. I mean, they want to have developers be able to make a living, and so they need to have like a big enough market for the content creators to create that. At the same time, that means that they're subsidizing it, and so like we're talking about. There's recently more discussions around this movement towards data. And I think that's probably one of the biggest, scariest things in terms of a lot of work that I've also been working on in terms of ethics and privacy and the right to mental privacy, because that it is this threat of when you're in these virtual worlds and they're tracking everything that you're looking at and all these physiological markers, then translating into these biometric profiles that they really potentially understand you more than you understand yourself.
Right.
Then, that's a theory. They might be able to do that. That may not actually be true. But if they're able to, I know Avi Bar-Shiv has talked about it, kind of like this ad model. There's an adage that says, a lot of times there'll be companies that they'll say 50% of our ad budget is a waste, but we don't know which half it is, right? So there's a certain amount of advertising is kind of like gambling, where they're just kind of putting bets, and that with all this additional physiological data, that they may actually be kind of like increasing the house's odds that they're going to be able to understand you enough to be able to sell different ads. And I think that's the threat, is that to what degree do you start to cross this threshold where they're able to kind of like decode your brain and decode all of your behaviors and understand you more than you understand yourself, to the point where it threatens your right to agency, your right to identity, and your right to mental privacy. These are these neural rights that have been starting to be talked about in terms of these neural technologies and XR, virtual and augmented reality, where once you get to a certain point, it's going to start to potentially threaten these underlying rights. My right to identity, where I can express who I am without you telling me who I am based upon you doing all this tracking. My right to agency. So I'm taking actions based upon my own sort of intentional free will choices, as to the extent that we do have free will. My intentional actions. When you have all these things that are subtly influencing you, then to what degree is that undermining your agency? And your right to mental privacy is like the sanctity of what's happening inside your mind and your body, and that you are making that conscious choice as to when you want to share that with somebody. When you have these technologies that are able to kind of reverse engineer all that and extrapolate that information based upon the context that you're in, then that is kind of threatening your rights to mental privacy. So there's all these sort of fundamental human rights that are starting to be talked about in terms of these neuro rights, that as these technologies develop, then a lot of these neuroscientists like Raphael Yusta from the Columbia Neuroscience has a neuro rights initiative that he started there, and the research that he's been doing, kind of like this existential, these neuroscientists saying, look, we're only going to get way better in decoding the brain, and it's already really scary. If we project that out into the future, we're kind of looking at these Black Mirror type of scenarios where what are the sort of guardrails to put into place that ensure that a company like Facebook doesn't get a hold of this type of information and start to, do mass manipulation of people. This line between behavioral modification and persuasion starts to get really, blended together. Like basically those two areas are using the same research. So the ethical line between persuasion and, manipulation is kind of like this unknown ethical threshold.
Yeah.
As to
Right.
when does it sort of cross over this creepy area when you have all this data on us?
Do you think, because right now the argument from big data and big tech is, well, it's all metadata. We're not looking at you as an individual. Sure, we're using the data, at a 35,000 foot view to deliver you the ads that you most want. We're not taking your individuality. We're not selling your individuality. We're not doing any of those sorts of things. So why be mad? And so what do you say to that, Ken?
That's actually not their argument. I think their argument is it gets into this whole. There's a different ways of looking at privacy. Privacy is either a property right, it's either a human right, or it's something that is sort of contextually dependent. So there's, Helen Nissenbaum's contextual integrity of privacy. So that theory says that there's appropriate flows of information given the context, right? And so when you go to a doctor, you give your doctor medical information, right? Or you go to a bank, you give your financial information. So there's certain contexts that we're in, and there's certain appropriate flows that we have. The challenge is that we're creating all these new contexts, and there's new flows that we don't have any sort of precedent for what the appropriateness of this is. And what their argument is that they're saying that your privacy is not a human right; it's a property right that you can trade, buy, sell, and trade to us. So that you sign this adhesion contract, and we're giving you notice and consent. So they're sort of arguing that you have informed consent, that you're freely giving over your consent to this data. And by signing this adhesion contract, which is basically a one-sided contract of a term of service or privacy policy, then that gives them carte blanche access to be able to do whatever they want with that data. Sort of like a digital colonization where you are signing over your rights to that data, and they can seize that data, and they can take ownership of it, and they can do whatever they want with it as long as they disclose it to you. I mean, within privacy law in the United States, it says as long as they tell you what they're going to do, it's all good. The FTC is only about false advertising. So if they do something that they didn't tell you they're going to do, then they give you. But they write these privacy policies to be so vague as to basically encompass basically anything that they want to do.
Well, and they also don't give you an opportunity to opt out, right? Either you opt in because you want in, or you don't get the opportunity to get in and opt out. And that's, I think that's part of the issue here. And Kent, we're going to turn it back over to you in a second, but I do want to reset the room real quick. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We've got an amazing show here. We're talking about both invasive and non-invasive brain-computer interfaces. We're talking about VR, XR, the metaverse, you name it, we're talking about it. And we're talking about the ethics associated with these things. If you haven't subscribed yet, make sure you click the link below and subscribe. Click the bell so you know whenever we go live. We've also got an amazing show tomorrow on the Unidentified Celebrity View. If you're not subscribed to that, make sure you click the link below and follow us over there. Lou, who do we got tomorrow?
So we've got a couple of folks over from the Nuno event, the National UFO Night Out. event that's happening this Saturday, July 17th. So they're going to come on the show for the first hour, talk about some equipment that you might want to pick up before you do the event, if you can. But other just tips and tricks. If you don't have equipment, it's fine. We're going to go over all of it. So you guys can be as successful as you could possibly be that night. And then when second hour, we've got Bryant the Dragon Arnold, who may or may not be bringing a friend. So that'll be fun. And then, Thursday we've got a big show with Lou Elizondo and his dad. That's going to be really fun. Thursday at 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. So, it's going to be a killer show.
I'm excited. Rather Be Squidding says, someday soon, Michael, you'll be able to reset the room with just your thoughts. Very much looking forward to that as well. We'll just all be sitting here just like, looking at each other like.
If I could kill the fruit fly with just my thoughts, that would be awesome.
We've got a feral fruit fly around here.
Well,
it would be banging.
It would be cool. I mean, can you imagine how many more shares, likes, and subscribes we'd get if we just did it like this?
Right.
All right. So we've got an amazing panel coming on right now. Kent, you can stick around, right? Yeah. Sure. All right. Awesome. All right. So we've got an amazing panel coming for you guys right now. We've got Aaron Desario. He is a science technology enthusiast and currently works as a staff software engineer at Google. He worked with Apple, where he co-invented and received a patent for iPhoto, a pioneer in digital photo organization. It's great to have you. What are your thoughts on that?
Yep, I got it. I agree
as well. That's an excellent point, Aaron. We've got Daniel Miller, who's an actor based out of Los Angeles, a lover of all things space and science. His curiosity has now led him to the UAP topic, where he was a political junkie. He focused on the movement and efforts within the U.S. government and scientific community. Welcome, Daniel.
Hello. Sorry, saying out loud instead of.
That's okay. That's okay. Neuralinks are hard to get used to.
Sure.
And last but certainly not least, we've got Carl Vibe. He's a full-time content creator. He recently launched his new show on Carl Vibe on YouTube to investigate the mystical aspects of reality and consciousness. How the hell are you, Carl?
I'm doing fantastic. This has been an excellent show so far. I've got a million questions. I'm going to try not to hijack the show from you guys.
Fantastic. Well, do you want to kick us off with a question? Do you have something you wanted to hit Kent with?
Yeah, we're talking about interface technology versus stuff that you just put on or is external to the body. And I had a question for Kent. What is your awareness or understanding of the stuff that's not attached to the body? How far away from the cranium or the skull can they have these sensors and have them still work? Because, in the Stanford Research Institute, they kind of figured out, like Ingo Swann and these remote viewers and people that seem to have like telepathic type abilities were able to change the temperature on vacuum sealed controlled devices, not even near the location, like they were controlling it with their consciousness. So is there any sensors or technology that are more spatial and play into that theory of panpsychism a little deeper that you're aware of?
Not in terms of brain control interfaces. The closest thing that I've heard of anything like that is the research that Dean Radin has done at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which is investigating the von Neumann-Wigner interpretation of the quantum measurement problem, which essentially is that the quantum measurement or the quantum wave function collapses upon observation, what you're doing kind of like psychically through your, kind of projecting of your consciousness out. So I know that Dean Radin has done some of this research and found some potential evidence that supporting the von Neumann-Wigner interpretation of quantum mechanics. However, it's only been replicated by, I think, one other entity. I think that in terms of replication, it's like kind of like a more exotic theory. I mean, if you watch the film Devs, which was all about sort of more of a deterministic take on quantum phenomena, it was sort of like the von Neumann-Wigner interpretation of quantum mechanics. The quantum measurement problem is sort of like highly disregarded as something that's sort of like not legitimate at all. So I don't think that a lot of folks have looked at it. I know that the Stuart Hameroff approach of sort of like theory of consciousness is that there's these microtubules, that there's sort of quantum effects that are happening at that level, but nothing that I've seen in terms of mainstream neuroscience is actually looking at sort of quantum effects when it comes to that. Most of them are doing like either FNIRS, which is functional near-infrared spectroscopy. FNIRS, it's called FNIRS, or EEG, which is just looking at the radiation of your brain waves. So there's not as much stuff that's sort of looking at any sort of more etheric fields from your body in that sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
Have you looked at any of the Stephen Wolfram's work, where he kind of discusses the existence of this bucket of space and atoms, and basically everything is entanglement that occurs at the speed of light, spreading outward, obviously in a light cone. But the idea there is that it's all done through entanglement of one atom to another atom, or one particle to another particle.
I know that I've only looked at it briefly in terms of like kind of like a computational approach of creating a theory of everything, and most of what I've heard there in terms of that, I mean, we're kind of getting into more metaphysical aspects where some of these things are non-falsifiable. You can't actually test one way or another. You kind of make an assumption that might be happening, and that may drive.
He's actually got a way, I think, to do that, or at least he's working on a way. So what he describes is that everything is irreducible computation, right? The universe consists of all of this irreducible computation space, and our consciousness is basically it's an emergent behavior, because we are able to define these areas where we can reduce and make projections, right? Physics and mathematics, for example, exist because we can quantify that and reduce it into something that we can get an answer by applying a calculation, whereas the rest of the universe is not computational at all, and just kind of exists out there. So we're these little floating bits of reducible computation is kind of the idea.
Yeah, I know that Lex Friedman did an interview with Roger Penrose, and in that interview, Roger Penrose was basically arguing that there's certain aspects of consciousness that are non-computable, right? That there's certain things that go beyond our ability to do computation, and that's sort of feeding off of his Penrose hammer off quantum interpretation. That's in terms of, again, back into the philosophy of mind, where they make an assumption as to what the nature of consciousness is. Again, we can't know for sure one way or another. So there's I think what we'll probably end up seeing is that people will make a strong assumption about what the nature of consciousness is, and they'll kind of take it to its logical conclusion. And then they're going to eventually hit a brick wall as to like things that they thought might be possible is either going to be possible or not going to be possible. I know within the sort of UAP community, there's a lot of talk about this human cognitive interface, which is essentially like a brain-computer interface without the technology. It's like direct telepathic communication. And so this is not something that we've figured out how to do in a reliable fashion in terms of peer-to-peer communication on whatever is happening. But if that is actually true, then that is an anomaly in terms of our existing reductive materialistic sort of metaphysical assumptions about the nature of reality. I'm a fan of someone like Alfred North Whitehead, who talks about process philosophy. That's a whole other sort of metaphysical framework that it sort of puts, rather than substance as the basic metaphysics, it puts processes. And so that you look at in terms of things in terms of these organisms and patterns of relationship, and that if you want to really talk about the fundamental aspects of the nature of reality, you have to look at it in terms of relationships and context. So these things that are kind of in relational context to each other. So that's sort of the process relational metaphysics. But again, these are metaphysical assumptions. And until there can be a real way to test some of these metaphysical assumptions, it's basically like a free-for-all. You can have whatever metaphysical assumption you want. It doesn't matter because there's no way to disprove it. So you have to basically say, this is what my metaphysical assumption is. The reductive materialism is saying that this is substance is the only thing. And so because of that, that's their metaphysical assumption. They've said any sort of direct path of communication is a priori impossible because it doesn't fit within their metaphysical framework.
Yeah, even the name physics implies that everything has to be based on physical reality. And when you get into the non-physical realities and consciousness don't have to necessarily obey the laws of physics or what our current understanding of that. And so I also was thinking of that because of the way that this is going to be approached and accepted by society. People are kind of resistant to the idea of synthetics and plastics and metal being implanted into their body, but having something exterior to the body that's able to just detect and interface with their consciousness is more like a soft and natural approach, it seems. and also like bioidentical, like CRISPR integrating into this type of research to where they're actually taking your own genes and then growing the implants to put in you and that being more accepted or something like that. Or have you heard anything about that? And then I'll let everybody else talk for a while.
Well, I'm, again, sort of, whenever you start to talk about CRISPR, you're like editing your DNA.
Yeah.
And again, I sort of put that in the same class as like invasive BCI. You know, that's like a very aggressive type of thing that I really want to progress with a lot of caution. I think what I've heard from different communities of, say, like the Institute of Noetic Sciences and the work of Bruce Lipton and the biology of belief, you know, the role of epigenetics, I think over time has shown that, you know, there's ways in which that genes get expressed given the certain context. And what I expect is that, you know, you could be putting yourself into these virtual environments that could start to change your gene expression. I mean, it's possible that there's ways that you could start to tap into latent human potentials without having to sort of directly edit your genes, but you just is more of a contextually driven thing to tap into something like epigenetics and gene expression, which I think is something that is, when I've talked to different people like Cassandra Veaton from the Institute of Noetic Sciences, she talks about this concept of these kind of latent human potentials of things that maybe there's new expressions of our genes that we haven't necessarily figured out yet because we haven't been in the right context. So a lot of these immersive technologies are all about creating sort of artificial or synthetic contexts. And, you know, I'll just one example to kind of say what's even possible. The concepts of neuroplasticity and, you know, James Blaha is somebody who had lazy eye, and he had one of his eyes that couldn't see in 3D. It was like basically the brain was ignoring all the input from that eye. And he said, I'm going to create a VR experience that increases the intensity to the bad eye and decreases it to the good eye. And his very first VR experience, he's able to actually see in 3D for the first time. He was able to take essentially like a muscle that was not trained and be able to control the perceptual input to his body to be able to essentially train his muscle. So he has a whole company now that is doing these kind of like being able to allow people to kind of rewire their brains. So this concept of neuroplasticity, your brain's plastic, and you can start to give yourself input through your sensory experiences to be able to change, you know, your actual ways that your brains are wired. So, you know, take that concept of neuroplasticity and being able to kind of rewire your brain and kind of expand it out in terms of, are there ways to kind of teach ourselves to do these types of, you know, subtle things that we, you know, only an advanced yogic master would be able to do. I think that's where you start to get into like sort of like what's even possible. We don't know. I mean, that's what makes it so exciting is we're in this era where we're kind of right at the cusp of being able to potentially kind of like do something that no one's ever been able to do before. Or maybe they have, and that there's no reliable way to do it. But that with the virtual reality technologies, you're able to kind of take what was essentially an ephemeral phenomenological experience and kind of recreate it for everybody. So that now people play Beat Saber, they're like, oh, I know what that experience is because I've had that too. And you're in each other's living rooms and you're just using these mediated technologies. And so
everybody gets to be a Buddha. Amazing.
Well, the real question is though, if you created an avatar, would it be better looking than this? I mean, is it possible? Is it possible to create? Is it possible to create a better looking avatar than this? I say no.
That's the real reason. The real reason I go on these panels is because it's just fantastic for my self-esteem.
Yeah. Yeah, you better be booking roles after these shows, buddy.
Can we give Daniel an opportunity to maybe ask a question or maybe kind of share a thought rather than?
Well, that's how I brought him in.
Beautiful man in the room.
That's how you bring him in, bro. You gotta roll out the red carpet for this guy.
Yes, I'm gonna become a monster after a few more of these. I'll be in my trailer.
Yeah, constantly looking in the mirror.
Yeah, exactly. Kent, good to talk to you in person, man. Well, I guess I'm curious then, because as you mentioned, we kind of are on the cusp of this field here, and this field of is very much married to the discovery of how the brain works. It seems, as far as I understand, I'm no neuroscientist, but we don't seem to know. We know some, but we really don't know a lot about the brain. And so, do you think? It is I would say that it's in the commercial best interest of these companies, whether it be whatever Facebook's plans are or, you know, Neuralink. Do you think maybe a lot of the future scientific endeavors might even come from these companies because it is in their commercial best interest to advance this topic as much as possible to utilize their medium? Or what do you think about the long-term effects of the scientific endeavors in this world?
Well, first, I think we do actually know quite a lot about the brain from neuroscience in terms of the mind and how consciousness actually works. I think that's where you start to get more of a gap in terms of like, why do we have this sort of phenomenal consciousness? I think that's still a little bit of a mystery. And, the difference between brain control and mind machine interfaces. But, there's also been critiques of, say, Elon Musk's Neuralink in terms of like the big monkey thing that went viral that, there's basically a monkey controlling, basically playing like pong and other things with its mind. And Andrew Schwartz was quoted in an article in Inverse saying, he was doing stuff like that like back in 2008, but actually it was more sophisticated. And so there's ways in which that some neuroscientists have called Neuralink like neuroscience theater, because it's a little bit of like creating this kind of theatrical, the viral videos, but stuff that research that was happening like 12 years ago. So it's not like they're not. There are some technological innovations that they're doing that are pushing stuff forward. There's no doubt there, but there's some of the foundational research that academia has been already doing and is in some ways ahead of where they're at. They were doing like 2D as an example, doing 2D controls, and they were able to do like full 10 degrees of freedom. Having a monkey move a robot arm and feed itself back in like 2008 from Andrew Schwartz. So I would say that the companies, the different there was when Oculus came out and had their technology. The big question that Henry Fuchs asked at the 2014 IEEE VR was, why didn't academia create what was essentially possible for a number of like 5 or 6 years? And there's a difference when you have a capital infusion and try to create a product. You try to synthesize things together rather than kind of do incremental innovations. Which really create it into a product. You got to bring it all together. So it is possible that some of what Neuralink is happening is that they're going to sort of productize this in a point where you could have an elective surgery of some of this stuff. Right now, it's going to only be with kind of people with neurodegenerative diseases. But maybe there's other innovations that they're doing in terms of the foundations of these invasive technologies that are going to be really fundamental that would have never happened from academia. But I think it's like I said earlier, I'm more a fan of the non-invasive techniques just because it's so amazing what you can already do without having to put a chip in your brain.
Just quickly, you said some of these folks were doing these experiments back in 2008 and they were highly successful. And then you have Neuralink now using it almost as a marketing tool to further the company's goals. And we all know that the company's goals are to help people who are, quadriplegic and all of these different. But I'm curious why in academia we were having these breakthrough results 10, 12, 15 years ago, but it's just now getting to market. And if that's just a normal life cycle of these sorts of things and how long it takes to get to market from academia, and then, kind of where, I guess my question is like, should we be supporting this, what Neuralink is doing, or do you find it just to be far too invasive?
Oh, well, there's a couple of questions there. Should we be supporting Neuralink? I don't know. I mean, I think it's giving more awareness, but again, I'm more skeptical about the invasive. I mean, there's other companies like Kernel that were also, Brian Johnson also wanted to do an invasive technique, but they did a pivot into doing like non-invasive techniques. And so will Neuralink continue to do invasive techniques forever? To be able to get this stuff cleared from the FDA, I mean, that's a long pathway. And, that still, even if they do that, you're talking about brain surgery to get some of this stuff.
If the UAP stories are true, then, it's possible that there is, the ability to do this non-invasively, right? The stories are that people's entire realities have been changed just from contact from a beam or, something like that.
Yeah, externally mediated or being able to sort of directly communicate in that way. I mean, like that's something we don't really understand at all. And so it'll be a while, maybe we'll be able to get
probably 100, 200 years down the road. But, I can imagine a helmet that is, has the ability to measure all of the fields in your brain. And, eventually the sensitivity will get up to the point where it will be able to tell what you're actually thinking.
Well, what if it was as simple as a hat?
Yeah, it could be a beam, or even, Apple will come out with a new earbud of some sort that does all this.
Ken, I Oh, go
I wanted
ahead.
to get back to the other part of your question, Michael, just quickly, because there's a technology consultant named Simon Wardley, and he talks about these different phases that technology diffuses, and it goes through 4 main phases. One is the academic idea, where you kind of prove it out, like the duct tape prototype, and then you start to have the custom bespoke enterprise applications of it being applied in a certain context, and then you have the mass consumer product, and then you have it's like mass ubiquitous. And so a lot of technologies go through those different phases. It's like VR at first, was created in 1968 with the sort of Damocles. The consumer phase came with Jaron Lanier in the 90s with sort of NASA and Silicon graphics machines that were $1 million. And now we have like Oculus Rift and HTC Vive and PlayStation. That's basically the consumer phase. And then eventually it'll potentially get to that kind of mass consumer phase. So just the same, technology diffuses through those different phases. So even though there was the research that was first done in 2008, then you have like basically taken that research and trying to sort of do it. And what I would say is the enterprise application, meaning that this is not something that anybody can just go get a brain implant of Neuralink. This is for like the medical conditions with people with neurodegenerative diseases. And it's going to be a very small population at first. And so that's kind of like the custom bespoke applications. And then once that's proved out, then eventually it could potentially move into this elective surgery, meaning the kind of consumer phase. Elon Musk is kind of betting on this kind of invasive route. But there's other folks like Facebook that are betting on the complete opposite route, which is the non-invasive. Right. If I were a betting man, I would bet on the non-invasive because I think that it's already been proven how much you can do just by looking at something like speech synthesis of what they could only do with ECOG, which is invasive, being able to synthesize someone's thoughts into sounds. And within the next 5 or 10 years, we'll see if that'll be done non-invasively. If then it is, then you could have this kind of thing where it's like the non-invasive is kind of like that enterprise phase, but in order to go to mass consumer scale, people aren't going to be getting like brain surgery. They're going to just buy the non-invasive version if it has that with the AI on top of it. And that's what I expect to be more likely.
That's fascinating. I thought this was going down. I honestly, bro, like I really appreciate your context here because I thought this was going down a very different route. I thought people were going to start betting heavily on the invasive and not on the non-invasive. But you're giving me a lot to think about, specifically when you brought up the epigenetic expressions, right? Because we always talk about in philosophy, nature versus nurture, and in psychology as well, nature versus nurture. But this idea of epigenetics really brings out the idea that you can, by using different environments and potentially virtual reality environments, you can begin to test in what ways you can engage the genes to express themselves in different ways. I mean, this is fascinating.
I think it also will play into mental science too. You can use it for addiction treatment and replacement therapies. On the other hand, you might have created an entirely new addiction problem.
Right?
Yeah.
I was thinking of like situations like epilepsy and dementia, and the ability, like just like we put a pacemaker on the heart, these ability to regulate brain functioning and consciousness to help people's awareness stay focused, or to cure some of these things from that approach. It's really interesting stuff.
Yeah, there's over 30 years of research when it comes to applying VR to medical applications, and so I think there's going to be a wide range of virtual therapeutics, as well as the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. Let's not forget that they've been basically going down the path of getting psilocybin approved by the FDA. So we're going to be having like a whole like psychedelic revolution coming up here, where there's going to be like psychedelic drugs are going to be. MAPS is basically becoming like a pharmaceutical company, and they're going to be like having like the sole ability to be able to sell psilocybin as a psychedelic treatment. So psychedelic treatments on top of other treatments, I think there's a lot of ways in which that there may be things in which that the invasive techniques would be able to address very specific things. But I would put a lot of faith on the non-invasive techniques for how far that can go, especially when you start to get into like the psychedelic treatments. That's just at the beginning of going mainstream in terms, like we talked about the different phases. Well, that's going from something that is like the more enterprise thing into like the mainstream once you have FDA approval for something like psychedelic treatments for like psilocybin. Right. So there's things like that when I go to the future this consciousness hacking awakened future summit, was this fusion of psychedelics and immersive technologies and these contemplative techniques all being blended together. The whole psychedelic revolution that's going to be happening and being legitimized, that's going to be a whole other area, which again, I put my faith on sort of the non-invasive. You are putting substances in your body,
Right.
but you're not putting a chip in your brain, which I think is a lot. People are going to be a lot more easily take a mushroom or psilocybin than they are going to put these chips in their brains. But
it almost seems like the specific brain function or nervous system function type things are going to be more invasive, whereas the mind healing and the different things that we can do that way are going to be more non-invasive.
I can't remember.
Oh, sorry, Kristen, go ahead.
No, I can't remember whose research it was, but yesterday they were doing research on flashing light therapy and ketamine, which is a psychedelic anesthetic.
Right.
Very, very successful in treating Alzheimer's. Dementia.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. Well,
Because
this
it,
was
like rewinds the brain a bit, wakes it up, and helps it remember like within a week.
Wow. It's amazing.
I was going to say, this is a pretty cool comment from Kevin Childress. Non-invasive capabilities could amount to assault if you don't consent. Mind rape, so to speak. That's kind of scary too, right? Because if you can perfect a non-invasive technique where you don't have to strap anything to anybody, is that a way to sort of hack into somebody's brain?
Yeah, you can project an augmented reality or holographic experience, a psychic experience into people without them knowing it. And honestly, we don't even know if that's actually the situation we're in already.
With abductions, right? It's possible that abductions are strictly a psychological phenomenon that is projected into your sleeping body.
Well, I know that when I talked to Connor Rusamano from the Open BCI, I talked about this, the fear around, because there's the reading and the writing to the brain. The writing to the brain is where I think the invasive techniques start to get more scary. But his point was that, look, you already have the writing of the brain when you have these closed loop systems of like looking on Instagram, looking on Facebook, looking on Twitter. There's ways in which that, the algorithmically driven reality bubbles that we're already creating with our technology, we're already at the point of kind of reading and writing to the brain in terms of the ways that culture can be shifted through these technologies and these influencer networks. And so in some ways, we've already kind of crossed that Rubicon. And I think this is one of the big issues of technology ethics is like, okay, if we already are at this point of kind of uncontrollable reading and writing to the brain, then what are the boundaries? How do you put some guardrails and limits on this? And, that's where you have different, tech policy legislation for, filter bubble legislation and whatnot. But when you start to get into immersive environments where you're able to control every aspect of the brain, and then not only that, but things that are below your level of perceptual awareness, so be able to subtly shift and change your thoughts based upon the environmental and experiential design that you can't even articulate what you experienced or why. I think we're still in the very early phases, but just like we have information warfare, it's pretty easy to extrapolate that we might be able to have experiential warfare as we move forward. And what are the ethical boundaries around that? And that's the big reason why I've been sort of involved in some of these different ethical discussions around all this as well.
Well, I can't wait to see who writes the book on ethical boundaries for that.
That's like experiential warfare. That's the name of the book.
Yeah,
Wow.
Maybe Susan Goff. So we do have a special guest who just popped in. I'm not really sure who it is, and it's time to reset the room, Michael. So should we do that?
Yeah, let's go ahead and reset. So for those of you just joining us, make sure that you click the subscribe button, click the bell so you can get notified whenever we go live. We've got a pretty fun special guest. So I've been chatting back and forth with this person, and they wanted to pop on, being kind of negotiating their conversation. You're not going to be able. They said that they do not want to be seen. They were only willing to be heard. They're not willing to share their face, but I think I'm just going to go ahead and pop this person in here. Can you hear us? Can you hear us?
Right, excuse me. Can you, I've been drinking. Excuse me. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Chaz Shaw.
It's Chaz Shaw.
Chad, are you related to our regular guest?
All right, that's why I'm here. I'm going to make this clear once and for all. I am not Jazz.
No. Are you his brother or uncle or?
We're completely different guys.
Michael, what the hell is going on here?
I don't know. So I spoke with.
What is going on here?
Listen to me. I spoke with Chris Plain.
This up. I've been drinking. I'm sorry.
I spoke with Chris Plain the other day, and Chris told me that we had somebody who wanted to come on the show and speak, and kind of set the record straight as to who he is. So I gave him a shot. So
I'm not sure that's a he, but
Luis, can I say to you, Luis, konnichiwa? Like, very handsome. Very handsome Japanese man.
What is happening right now?
What is happening?
So you're so
First of all, I have 10 ways you can tell I'm not Jazz Shaw.
Oh.
I'm a totally different guy.
Really? Do we have to go through all 10? What's happening?
Hold on, I have to do a shot. You know how every time someone does a super chat, Jazz does a shot, right?
That's right. But you're not Jazz, you're Chaz.
Every time someone asks any question at all, I have to do a shot. So, hold on a second. Oh God!
okay. So that's different. Is there something else that you can share with us that's different that differentiates you from Jazz Shaw?
Yeah, look at my name. Look at the Look at the first right at the beginning. There's a CH, right?
Right.
Jazz,
Yep.
it's a J.
they're
Then you
different
go to the
people.
end of my name right there. There's 3 Z's. How many Z's in Jazz Shaw?
I believe 2.
That's right.
That-
You're completely different guys.
Very clear that they're different people.
This
is off the rails.
Dude,
Jazz
this
writes for hot
this
air, right?
this feels like an Andy Kaufman and what was his other character that he played?
Tony
God,
something.
Oh, Tony.
Help us out here, Chaz.
I'm sorry, I've been drinking.
Clifton. Tony Clifton.
Tony Clifton.
Tony Clifton.
You know,
This
I
is
have to do a shot. Hold on.
this is the Tony Clifton version of Jazz Shaw. What the hell is happening?
I am not Jazz Shaw. All right, listen, Jazz, he writes for Hot Air, right?
Right.
Right.
I write for Cool Breeze. Completely different job.
Okay, we've established you're 2 completely different people.
Okay, Jazz saw Bigfoot once. Did you know that?
I
No.
didn't know that.
Jazz, he talks about it. He will tell you he saw Bigfoot once.
Okay. So you haven't
I
seen
shared a
Bigfoot?
duplex with Bigfoot for 3 years. Right? And at the end of it, we did not get our deposit back. What is that?
What's your wife's name, Chaz?
You know, make sure that he pays the deposit.
That's a good question. What is your wife's name, Chaz?
All right, that's a good question. You know how his wife, when it's time, she goes, Jazz! Okay, what my wife does when it's
What is
dinner
your
time,
wife?
she just throws the food through the bars at the cage at me.
I'm sorry, you live in a cage, Chaz?
It's, you know, my wife has a lot of rules. Not like Jazz
Planning the
Shaw, I just
shots
can't
through
do
the
whatever
bars,
I
too.
want.
Oh my
All right, I have one more and then I gotta go.
Okay, all right, one more.
You know, Jazz Shaw wears V-neck shirts, right?
He
Does
does.
he?
Anytime he's on, he's got a t-shirt, he's got a V-neck.
I never noticed.
I never noticed that.
I wear V-neck briefs. All right, you know what? I'm not having fun. You guys think I'm Jazz Shaw. I quit. Come on.
What? What are you doing to this show, Michael? What have you done? All of that intelligent conversation we just had with Ken By it's non-existent. Never happened. Thanks to Chaz Shaw.
Do you want me to segue this?
Yeah, please, somebody.
It's not even possible.
Speaking of like monkeys being able to control technology, how?
Wait, that was not even a segue. That was a reset. You have just reset the room, Carl.
Oh, that was I think it was pretty going into a segue there.
How do you think that humans actually are at a disadvantage compared to the monkeys, that because we have so much analytical mental overlay in society and logic going on and language, and we're so attached to speech and language and the way that we have the conversation in our mind, whereas like these animals being tested in chimpanzees are almost at an advantage because they're more like in that neutral mind space or meditative space. And then a second question to that, Kent, do you think that like meditation is going to end up coming full circle, where this advanced future technology is going to require people to return to these very ancient methods in order to even be able to interface? What's your thoughts on that? How do you like that segue?
Yeah. So in other words, we have to have a solar flare to get back around the campfire to tap into this.
So the for the first part, I mean, there obviously is a bit of a hierarchy in terms of the level of organized consciousness, the cognitive processing and communication that humans have. Do other animals have more of that relative to VR? I don't know. I think that what's happening is actually that there's a bit of a shift that humans have done over these different cycles of Leonard Shlain has a book called The Word and Image. And we have these cycles between the word and the image. And we're kind of coming out of a 500-year cycle of the word from the Gutenberg press into the beginning of the turn of the century. And now we're getting into like, I'd say like 100 years of the image, which is much more into like the, kind of more spatial aspects and also immersive participatory, media. So, but there's also been, there's a guy named Alex McDowell who's got a world building institute, and he also talks about the evolution of storytelling, about how storytelling, the myths that were told in the ancient times, they were evolving and growing. They would change. They would be contextually relevant, and they would have people in the audience playing musical instruments. And so it was almost like this collaborative sense making and storytelling that would happen as a tribe in a community. And then once the ability to create a canonical version of those stories, then it became, that was the only version that then was static, right? So then you have that version that sticks. And I think we're moving more into that sort of interactive participatory phase of storytelling, where it's the living story, where you're a participant within the story of how it unfolds, rather than something that you're passively watching. So this move towards immersive theater, Sleep No More, Then She Fell, where you're kind of breaking down the fourth wall, the proscenium, and you're able to actually immerse yourself into the experience, and you become a character. And it's sort of like the Westworld metaphor, or Dungeons and Dragons, where the live action role play in Ready Player One does this to a certain extent, where you're kind of becoming a character. So what's it mean for us to become characters within these experiences, rather than just these passive recipients? Like you're passively receiving a book. There's still imagination that's happening, but your agency isn't actively changing the way that the story's unfolding. And so we're getting back to that, where you become an actor that has agency, where you can actually dictate how the story unfolds. It's like the holodeck of the Star Trek, where you're able to really become a part of that story. So that's where I see the first part.
Awesome.
Sorry.
The second part you were asking about, can you just rephrase that question?
Yeah, just the ancient methods of meditation coming full circle, and these ways of mindfulness being more prevalent in society as a need in order to even use the technology, in order to control your own thoughts, so you're not immediately shooting off into tangents in the augmented reality or onto porn websites when you're actually trying to look up a cooking recipe because you can't control that dialogue.
What kind of cookies do you look up, Carl?
What kind of shaped cakes are you eating, Carl?
I'm just saying, I autocorrect.
I don't know. Some of that
all the time on
really turns me on.
It's a really good question, because I think that every time I've done one of these different neural interface demos, it's inevitably always frustrating, because you go into this demo and you'll be like, okay, meditate, and you basically resonate on this sort of mental frequency, and then you'll see something happen, and you're like, am I doing it? I don't know. Is it working? Is it not working? And so there's this interrogation problem with these different types of experiences, which is there's always this question of like, are you doing it right? What's the real-time feedback? Can you really tell that you're achieving this sort of meditative state that they're trying to achieve? And I think when I've watched people like Connor Russomanno from OpenBCI, he's done these demos with these where he's able to, he's had many different years where he's able to kind of look at the real-time biofeedback and then be able to be like, okay, now I'm going to do this with my body, and then he does it. And so I do think that there's this this vision of kind of having this mastery over our attention, our physiological reactions, and being able to achieve those mental states more on demand, especially if we have different techniques that either binaural beats, which is like different ways to, which by the way, if people have ever really looked into the, what's the institute, there's this institute of that produces a lot of these binaural beats, which is a lot of what they use to kind of invoke these people into these kind of.
The Gateway Institute?
Yeah, well, yeah, it's the Monroe Institute.
Monroe Institute of the Gateway program.
The Gateway Experience, yeah. The
Hemisync.
Yeah, well, there's the Hemisync and the other sort of hemispheric synchronization. So there's ways to be able to listen to these binaural audios that kind of entrain your brain into certain modes of being. And the Monroe Institute has been, as a lot of the declassified documents have come out, and other people have said, they got a lot of money from these intelligence agencies to be able to give these different types of brain entrainment exercises to be able to prime people to do different aspects of remote viewing or whatever else. So there are ways in which that you could go through these training exercises just through audio entrainment, but it's going to be all these other aspects of brain entrainment that we get to be able to kind of get us into, like, you can think of it as like a groove where you repeat it enough times, you're able to kind of really drop into those grooves. And so what's it mean to be able to kind of drop into these mental flow states, which I think is the potential of VR, is to be able to kind of cultivate a flow state. So imagine, getting up every day and you just like enter in the most peak experience of a flow state where you're at like 2 to 3 times productivity of a normal, but you're able to just like drop into that. Yeah. I think that's the potential for what these types of real-time biometric feedback systems could provide to us, is ways of kind of, rather than having to meditate for, 50 years to be able to achieve that, there may be able to find ways of creating these virtual experiences and binaural beats and the audio and be able to entrain your brain and psychedelics or whatever combination it is of all these things to be able to achieve these specific mind states and to be able to reliably enter into that. I do think that's a big part of where this is going, especially if you look into things like Mickey Siegel and the consciousness hacking movement of different people that have been trying to kind of, use whatever, and they call it stacking, where you kind of stack different aspects of these things together to be able to achieve these different states. And I think that's what they're already starting to see with like the psychedelic therapies and things like, holotropic breath work and other sort of ways of kind of invoking these altered states of consciousness without doing the psychedelics, but doing these different specific types of practices back to each other to be able to kind of like reach these states. I think we're going to be in a place where there's going to be technologically assisted ways of us achieving those mind states.
Right. And it's right now it's so easy to like, you think about folks who, you think of a lot of journalists and writers will literally take, and they're not being prescribed, Adderall and things like that, but they're taking it for those mind states to be able to write, just for 5 hours straight or something like that. It's interesting to think what the potential is for these sorts of virtual reality experiences to give people the ability to kind of drop into these mental states without having to take a psychoactive substance.
Could they teach a physical skill like learning to play guitar?
Ooh.
There's a lot of different VR training. A big part of VR training is, number one, being in places that you couldn't normally go. But if you think about like taking a multiple choice test versus being embedded within the context and having the pressures of the environment and being able to have to make the right choice and the right decision. So Walmart actually has been doing a lot of training for people for like Black Friday training. I mean, Black Friday happens once a year, but there's certain things that managers need to be able to walk around and be able to notice and take action on to be able to prevent other things from happening. But also like elite football players. And so Striver has been a VR company that has been able to train like some of the NCAA winners, that the quarterbacks have been doing these VR trainings.
Wow. So
with quarterback training, you can only be on the field for a certain amount of time, but you could do VR repetitions where they do like these 360 videos. And a lot of what a football player, a quarterback is doing is having this sort of situational awareness where they're able to identify where the defense is and be able to dynamically adapt and change what their actions are and know who's open and who's not open. And these are things that they have to kind of look at where things are at and project out into the future and make these snap decisions. And so the quarterbacks, these elite quarterbacks, have been able to do these VR trainings to be able to basically kind of increase the number of repetitions, because they could only do so many physical repetitions because there's limits. They limit especially in NCAA, but also their physical limits. But you can start to do these different types of VR training exercises. So there's all sorts of different ways of doing soft skills training, and elite quarterbacks to like Walmart to NASA training and military training. I mean, that's how this all started, was military
Right,
training.
that's simulations essentially. Airline pilots, for example. But I see this going a step beyond that in being, you're not actually going to take the physical action. You're just going to learn how to do the physical action. Is I guess what I'm saying.
Well, isn't that the Matrix, when you're like, I learned Kung Fu, like the download, but that's the hardest part, right? Because this idea of being able to, you were bringing this up earlier, Kent, this idea about reading versus writing on the brain. And so it's one thing to be able to read the brain. It's another thing to be able to write on the brain. Do you think that's incredibly far off? And do you think that only non-invasive or invasive techniques are helpful in developing that technology?
I'm skeptical that we're going to have like a Matrix situation where you push a button and then you wake up and you say, I know Kung Fu, right?
Right.
There's certain ways in which that you have to like,
I know. I'm so pissed.
You have to like take the action, and it's like, again, it's not just the brain, it's your entire body. And anybody who's played the game Beat Saber will know this, because Beat Saber, there's certain levels to it where you have to, that's the game where you're basically having the swords and you're chopping the blocks, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you have to be able to identify the blocks coming, know the pattern, and then know how to move your body to be able to chop those blocks. And that's something that you actually can't just do with your mind. You have to do with your coordination of like seeing the pattern, making the choice, actually moving, and sort of training your body to move in a precise way. Anybody that's done any sort of kinesthetic training knows that you can't just skip the practice of that.
Your muscle.
Right, but if you have a glove though that's
Right.
measuring, if you have a glove that is measuring your responses, as you talked about earlier, you don't have to physically have the arm. You just have to think about the arm, and then the prosthetic would respond to that. So if you could train your brain to think about a proper Kung Fu move, then without actually having to make a Kung Fu move, it would just measure your arm. It's kind of a biofeedback scenario, I guess.
We do it within the virtual world.
Exactly.
Well, so there's different ways of like, so there's this whole concept of homuncular flexibility, which Jaron Lanier has talked about, which means that you can train yourself to become an octopus in VR. So you could like have these individual motor neurons and then be able to like control different aspects of having multiple limbs, right? So it's one thing to be able to manipulate and control virtual representations of yourself. It's another thing to be able to actually express your physical movement within reality. And so what you're talking about in terms of having those virtual representations, like you could potentially kind of do a mental training, and all of a sudden you could just be an octopus and be able to kind of have additional limbs and be able to, basically
they have 9 brains. I wasn't thinking about the physical representation. I was like, don't they have 9 brains?
They're able to control. The point is that you have additional limbs. So,
yes.
Jeremy Bailenson a VR researcher that's been able to kind of, I've done one of these different experiences that has been released now, where you're actually kind of like able to train this third arm that's coming out of your chest just by kind of moving your hand. And the thing is that when you see a physical representation of something moving, and your brain sees that, and you kind of correlate that to your motor cortex, your brain is very plastic. So then you're just like, oh yeah, this is how I control my third arm. You just kind of switch it this way. So,
sorry. I was going to say maybe Kung Fu is kind of a stretch, because you're talking about you're not going to be able to transcendently gain flexibility to be able to kick over your head. Your legs are still going to be stiff and tight if you haven't done the stretching, even though you may have that cognitive repetition and input. But maybe something like driving a stick shift car or working at a certain workstation is something that could be sort of trained with haptic feedback in a more like a analog sort of environment, rather than something dynamic where you physically have to gain new biological abilities, like being able to do the splits. You're not going to get that out of a download in your mind.
Well, the question is, can you actually practice kinesthetics in the brain alone? Do you actually have to move the arm, or, can you learn something in a dream? Can you, experience a certain movement without actually having to move that arm. That's the weird.
You could in your brain, but your actual body wouldn't be able to keep up with you.
Oh, you're saying because it just wouldn't be as skilled at it.
Yeah, well, you wouldn't be in shape of a kung fu master. You'd just be Mike, with the ability to do the kung fu, but you're not as fast, you're not as strong, you're not as well trained. Your lungs aren't as used to the movements here's where I see this technology really having a substantial impact, and that is this transition from, say, an old infrastructure to a new infrastructure. And there's going to be a huge group of people that are not going to have the education or the skills to step into, say, I don't know, a solar roadway or something like that, right? Something that is technologically difficult to learn by either reading a textbook. For me, like, if you put me in a virtual reality where I could learn how to put this highway together and I get haptic feedbacks on when I'm doing something wrong versus when I'm doing something right, it's I can see how that could be a really great transition for a truck driver, because pretty soon there's not going to be any more truck drivers, or a waiter, any blue collar worker that is going to be left in the dust in this digital revolution, or this machine revolution, or this singularity. There's still going to be a place for blue collar work, but the issue is, how do you get these blue collar people caught up to the technology that they have to learn in order to work on this tech and implement it into the American society? I think that's where this is perfect for that.
Well, one of the trends that I'm seeing, at least when it comes to a lot of where the actual biggest innovations when it comes to augmented reality and HoloLens is in what would be more of those typical blue collar jobs of frontline workers in a factory, using HoloLens to do augmented reality, construction workers, different ways in which that nurses and being trained. So there are different ways in which that the technology is being diffused out into some of these different jobs to be able to do kind of like remote assist and different things like that. But I think that the deeper point that you're making in terms of the future of work and everything else, I mean, that's a whole other discussion in terms of like the displacement of jobs and AI but also this shift from an economy that's based upon buying and owning objects and stuff, potentially into a world where it's going to be much more about the immersive experiences that you have access to. And I think we're already potentially starting to see that, where people maybe value going out to eat and having an experience, or having an immersive experience, or going into a live event or something like that. This kind of playing video games certainly is kind of in that immersive realm, but talking generally in terms of these different types of immersive experiences in the future of these economies, I think we're going to be putting in the future a lot more value into these one-on-one, custom, bespoke, immersive entertainment experiences, where it's basically like a bunch of people that are, what we see in terms of immersive theater. But yeah, I mean, in terms of how it all scales out, I mean, that's
Why
still.
don't you go to a movie theater?
I don't have a good vision of how.
And watch the same movie.
Yeah.
What's that?
I said, why go to a movie theater when you could all just meet on Discord, sit next to each other, and watch the same movie and have a chat?
Right, but there's no like smell of popcorn and like I don't know, movie being a little too loud and the dark and the quiet and
An app like that exists, where I think it's called Big Screen or something, where you can sit in like a digital movie theater with your friends and watch and buy a movie and watch it together, or VR.
Wow. Do you get the smell of popcorn though?
Yeah. Do you get smell-o-vision with that?
Well, I have a microwave.
That's in the next
It's probably
prototype.
coming. I mean,
I mean, look, I do like
It's a
this
DLC.
idea. Like, I feel like we're starting to find out, well, especially as tech is coming, that, for example, we just had a billionaire Virgin Atlantic, Richard Branson or whatever his name is. He just went into space. One of the first regular schmoes to go into space. So I feel like, I don't know, I could be wrong on that, but like this idea that you're gonna need blue collar work in space to build things. I could just imagine a point where we're at a time where a 1 day 8-hour shift in space is just as normal as going to work an 8-hour shift at wherever you work. So this idea that you can train on whatever task you're sent up there to do virtually. So that way, when you get up there, it's almost like, if you ever been to a new job
virtually, Lou.
Yeah, well, it's almost like, if you've ever been to a new job,
and then the machine would be up there.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Well,
So-
someone just said that a crane operator is now, some crane operators are now remote. And that's brilliant, because now you're taking the danger of having a crane operator attached to the side of a building, that's a good thing.
Or what about surgery? Doctors
Yeah.
being able to practice a surgery 1,000 times virtually before they're actually operating on a human being.
Not
I would
only
feel
that,
a lot
but-
safer with a doctor trained in VR before
Hell yeah.
I go under the knife.
Not only that, but literally using VR to operate a robot from 1,000 miles away in an area where they can't get to. Like, that's extraordinary.
Yeah, this is all stuff that's happening. And there are issues in terms of accuracy and latency that when it comes to remote sort of teleoperation. But in terms of training surgeons, also VR just raised like $27 million, and so there are, and there's a number of different places that I've seen over the years that have been doing that. So yeah, I mean, I think for me, VR is sort of unlocking. And I've talked to different people from NASA, Jeff Norris, who talked about sort of the tele-astronauts who were able to kind of send out these robots and be able to have people operating these. I think the latency of line of sight when it comes to the normal speed of light is going to be a limit in terms of using, something like Hal Puthoff's quantum communication could potentially have something that is instantaneous communication. If you have instantaneous communication, then you'd be able to if you have some sort of using of entanglement to be able to get beyond the limits of space and time when it comes to the signal, the latency is going to be an issue, some of these different things. And so, I mean, this is obviously a little bit more speculative, but I know that Puthoff has different, patents for quantum communications. So if it is possible to use quantum effects to be able to do real-time taking in a bunch of, there's only a certain amount of qubits, and you probably need a lot more qubits to be able to take all the bandwidth of all the different signals that you're getting. But
Plus, you have to send all those qubits on a rocket over there in real time first.
Yeah. So yeah, that's more speculative in terms of using VR to be able to do exploration, but because especially when it comes to real time. But yeah, I mean, for me, VR is all about becoming more connected to yourself, more connected to each other, and more connected to the planet. I think that as we talk about going up into space, there's a certain thing that we're not necessarily talking about, which is that we're not necessarily in right relationship between us and the planet already. So when we start to talk about colonizing space, we also have to kind of realize, okay, we have a lot of ways to go in terms of really being in regenerative cultures and being in right relationship to the world as it is right now. And I think that's one thing that I see that the VR technologies could potentially help us to maybe start to rebuild some of those different ways in which that we're not necessarily in right relationship with the world around us.
I have a question as it relates to the name of this show. So obviously we're called the Singularity Lab, referring to the technological singularity, the point at which human life becomes so different, so vastly different than our 21st century counterparts. What do you think? A, do you believe that the technological singularity will happen? B, when? And then C, what role do you think BCI and VR play in that transition?
I'm more of a skeptic of the concept of a singularity, because I mean, my understanding of the singularity is that you basically reach a point where you have AI that is so super intelligent that it changes the entirety structure of the world so fast that you can't understand the nature of reality because things have evolving so quickly. I mean, to some extent, we're at that point, but at the same time, it also implies. I mean, part of what I have a problem with people like Ray Kurzweil is that you sort of have this kind of projection of the AI as a god, as these super intelligent gods, and then you become subservient to that god. Whereas AI to me is more of something that is a tool that we're using to basically encourage human flourishing rather than to sort of achieve some sort of metaphysical state of superintelligence that is above and beyond everything. Plus, every time you try to model something, the model doesn't always map reality, and so there's always this kind of to what degree is it able to kind of project out into the future based upon a lot of these language models that you have in AI. They're able to kind of look at what has happened in the past, but language is something that changes and evolves over time. And so if you were to basically cut off a lot of the input of all that, then it would basically go out of date because the language continues to change and evolve. So to what degree do you have good models of knowledge representation within these AI models, into these AGIs that are able to actually kind of mimic the evolution of how human consciousness evolves as well? I tend to think that humans have something innate in our consciousness that goes above and beyond what we're ever going to be able to really fully simulate and model in AI, which means that AI is always, to me, going to be a tool that's subservient towards, human flourishing and allowing us to be able to create a better world for all of us, rather than creating this sort of like mythical AI god that is going to sort of create these sort of out of control positive feedback loop cycles of the technological singularity, where it gets so crazy that we can't really conceptually understand what's happening. I don't necessarily see that as a good outcome for where this could or should go.
Oh, I don't
Not only does
necessarily
every
see it as a
computer have
good
an
outcome
output.
either. I'm just curious. The idea is that, what you're talking about is narrow AI and then AGI, and then you're talking about a SI, but you're saying you don't think that would actually happen, or because I'm not saying it should be a goal. I'm just curious if you think it's feasible, or if you think that it's not even feasible.
I mean, you have when you look at technology evolution, you basically have like the near term and then the far term, and there's an adage that says that you basically overestimate the impact of technology in the short term, and you underestimate it in the long term. So with that, I mean, we can know that there's going to be a huge impact, that we're probably underestimating it, but at the same time, there's a lot of limits in terms of modeling of reality into these sort of AI agents. I've been to a number of different, the joint conference of the ICHIs, International Joint Conference of Artificial Intelligence. And so what I've learned from there is that there's people like Nick Bostrom who write books about superintelligence, but yet he doesn't potentially understand some of the basics of what the AI researchers that I talk to that are basically he doesn't understand this or this, right? So I think it's hard to understand whether or not he's philosophically projecting out into such a far future that we can't necessarily ground into it, and that his philosophical ideas of superintelligence are going to come true at a certain point, but at this point it's too early, or that he just is kind of an out of touch philosopher who's not actually in direct communication to the communities that he's philosophizing about, which, by the way, happens quite a bit when it comes to the philosophical communities. Like the math community, I've been to a number of different joint mathematics meetings with practicing mathematicians and the philosophers of math. They're on completely different, pages in terms of what they're even talking about, that they're not really in dialogue with each other. So in that way, Bostrom kind of out of touch with what's happening with the heart of what's happening in AI right now. And because of that, there's certain ways in which that his ideas are not necessarily landing. And there's actually a lot of skepticism within AI researchers in terms of some of the different ideas that he talks about. And so I think as we go along, maybe that'll change, and maybe some of his prophetic, dilemmas that he talks about superintelligence will come to pass in 15 to 20 years. But I think at this point, it's still a little bit too early to tell.
Right.
Not only does every computer have an off switch and every software job have a kill switch, but you have to actually work very hard to keep all of these things running. So I can't imagine a scenario where this emergent behavior comes out of nowhere that we didn't see coming and we can't stop, right? You can just pull the plug on the machine or execute a kill on your software job. I don't see that emerging on its own.
It's fascinating for sure.
We're already kind of past that point of like the levels of complicated system dynamics that we don't fully understand.
Right, but we have machine learning models, right? And on photos, we use these machine learning models. I can turn them off. I flip a switch, and it no longer recognizes pool tables in photos. And so that's the kind of thing that we have full control over.
Yeah. Well, I think some of this stuff that the problem that I see, one of the big problems, and I think this is what Elon Musk was trying to do with OpenAI, is that the control of these AI entities into a very small number of different companies who are really dictating the future of where this all goes. There has been a difference in the AI community in the sense of a lot of information is shared, but there's a lot of the data that is, the real oil of the 21st century, the data to be able to train all this stuff. So given that there's only still a handful of companies that really have access to a lot of both the data and the resources to be able to train this. I mean, it costs lots of money to be able to train up these different neural nets. So it is unfortunate that there's only a handful of companies that are really dictating the future. Some of the stuff that, folks that I've talked to, like Connor Russomanno, has this, kind of concept of the Jiminy Cricket AI that's able to kind of like be there listening to what's happening to your data, but is a little bit more of your AI assistant that is a little bit more benevolent, that is under your full control of your data. Like, you own your data and you're able to control it, and you're able to have this AI entity that's able to kind of like overwatch all of the different patterns that are happening, and you're able to kind of tune different aspects of your life based upon different things that you want to try to create. So it tracks your data.
Your personal privacy bot.
I know we're up against the clock here, Michael. I've got one last question,
Sure.
And that is because we just, and I think we're going to review this here in the next couple of weeks. I know we got McClellan coming to talk about it, and also UFED Jane, because they were both in the show. So the Discovery Channel or Travel Channel, I can't remember which one of those, just put out a show called Roswell Final Verdict, and they used AI to determine whether or not these people were telling the truth. So they went back to old footage and they applied this AI to all of the witnesses that they filmed from the 80s on VHS. They've got the audio as well. And apparently this AI is able to detect patterns and facial expressions and all of these things, and then compute and give you a result whether or not these people are lying or being honest. Do you think that technology is good right now? I'm curious what your thoughts
Where's
are
the
on that.
Spoiler. What was the result?
Well, there's
No spoilers.
there's look, I've only seen the first episode, but they definitely had some compelling moments where they had some, like, the daughter of the sheriff that the rancher took the medals to and reported it. The first person to see it outside of the rancher was the sheriff. And the sheriff's daughter was talking about all of the things he went through to make sure that this was verified. Then he called the Air Force because, he was friends with people at the Air Force. And her story of her father's experience with these medals came back as a true story, but again, it's a secondhand story of somebody, so I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that kind of AI. Do you think that's something that, say, intelligence agencies are using, or any corporate entities for that matter?
Again, this is an area where I'm more skeptical in terms of the limits of what different types of things can do. There's a movie called Coded Bias that goes into the whole dynamics of, like, anything like this gets trained by the data that you input, right?
Correct.
So it's going to be limited, and also, deception detection and polygraph tests are also always a certain degree that may have some degree of legitimacy, but there's also ways in which that it's not true. So whenever you talk about deception detection and stuff like this, I mean, there's so many different contextual dimensions, and there could be, like, if you think about poker and poker tells, this is kind of like trying to, like, identify someone's poker tell. But it's someone's specific sign that they're getting from their body that's like their deception detection. And even if this AI algorithm is able to do that successfully, are they able to break it down and explain what exactly happened? Is it explainable?
Well, that's the thing. They don't really go into, they just talk about it. It is like this supercomputer. They never show the computer. They never show how they process the data or the voice or the images. It's just kind of like, trust us. We've got this computer. Just trust us. We're the Travel Channel. So it's got to be true, but they actually present it in a fun way, and I'll be honest with you, I've been compelled by it so far. I think of course, you just said that you don't hold a lot of water in this AI because it depends on who's writing the AI, so that's a very good point. But I did find it compelling. It's so far in the first episode, it seems like the people who are being honest have had the track record of being honest, and the people who have made mistakes, I wouldn't say have a track record of being dishonest, but the claims that they're making are way more outrageous than the folks who are telling the truth. So I found that interesting.
I would want to see, like, an independent calibration of, like, this type of system. And even if you did that, then you have the samples that you have that you have sort of tuning biases that you have. So maybe like whatever sample size is tuned to be able to get the right answer, but yet when you apply it in a generalized context, things like this get really, dangerous in the sense of, ways in which that you use algorithmic decisions to make decisions. Say like what happens if the government gets access to this type of stuff, and then this AI algorithm suddenly decides that you're lying, and then that that becomes a decision that actually sends you to jail. Well, that
Minority
is a whole
Report
other
scenario.
level of concern when it comes to that. That's why there's a lot of banning of facial recognition, is because of all the ways in which that it could be biased against certain demographics and not always be work. And when you're making decisions to be able to identify people and basically make a decision as to whether or not they're
wrongful arrests have already been made off of facial recognition
it's
mistakes. It's already happened, which is wild. Yeah, that's a good point.
So coded bias gets into that. And so when we're talking about this in the context of like, whether or not these witnesses to Roswell are lying or not, it has a little bit less weight of like sending somebody to jail for 30 years. And so, there's still limits in terms of the understanding, like these things are basically just trying to do linear regression to be able to make a decision. And you can do, GANs, which is generative adversarial networks, where you basically send noise at these things, right? So there's ways to basically, if you're trying to determine whether or not things a cat or a dog, there's ways to basically trick some of these machine learning algorithms. So visually it looks like a cat, but there's enough noise in the signal that the AI just decides that it's a dog, right? So there's things like that where the way that these work is that there's a million different features that it's looking at. And if you're in there, they're very susceptible. There's a lot of technical debt to these different things. And we shouldn't be putting a certain epistemological level that this is the truth, at the Scientific Coalition of UAP Studies, there was the Sky Hub, Chris Cosworth, who was talking about how, they were going to use AI to be able to falsify whether or not things were or UFOs or not. And I'm like, wait, okay. First of all, you can't, put an AI algorithm as a basis of creating an epistemological baseline to establish whether or not what is something true or not, because it all depends on the input in and what you're training with. Because if you put garbage in, you're going to get garbage out. So, like, how do you determine whether or not that?
I don't think it was falsification. I think they were
it?
just trying to identify candidates.
Well, I talked to him afterwards, and I think he sort of retracted his use of the word falsification, because falsification, in terms of the philosophy of science and Popper, has a very specific term, meaning that you've established a certain level of truth. So, when they're trying to eliminate certain possibilities, that's different than sort of establishing the baseline of falsification, which is essentially saying, because we have an AI that has detected sort of a something that that is anomalous, then therefore it is definitely a UFO or something.
Right, that's inductive reasoning, right?
I know shit. This, if I swear to God, is the last question. But is there any way, like, for example, let's say you create the AI, right? And you've got, I'm thinking of just, for example, oh God, why am I losing my train of thought? An interrogation room, right? They always film police giving interrogations to supposed criminals. And in these interrogations, they try to figure out whether or not they're lying. Now, you've got, I'm sure, millions of hours worth of footage and convictions and facts on these cases. Could you run the AI against existing things and see how accurate it is based off of things that we know are already fact?
I think most of the stuff that is happening is like against like image databases, where it's like a pretty strict binary of like, is this a cat or a dog? Or is this type of tree? And there's people that are humans that are able to be experts, and they have the tags, right? So you have this supervised learning where you basically know what the right answer is. Well, as soon as you start to get into complex human dynamics where there's all these other contextual dimensions, something like common sense is something that AI doesn't really do a good job about yet, because it can't create a model that is able to kind of encompass all these nuanced contextual dimensions. So when we talk about, establishing truth with this big, large sets of data, and again, even when you have juries, there's a bias that humans have. So, is whatever thing that you're doing to train this going to basically be amplifying all this stuff? So, anyway, I think there's limits to all this AI stuff. That's sort of my takeaway. And I don't know. I feel like there's certain ways in which that I like to see it as assisting us and very bounded. but yet to be very skeptical about how far we put our trust into some of these things.
Absolutely. Kent, absolute pleasure having you on today. Thank you so much. We really appreciate your time and your expertise and your passion and your skill. We would love to have you back again very soon. I know we got into the AI topic and got off the computer brain interface topic, but I think it all kind of blends together, and it's important to have these conversations and contextualize them. So thank you so much. We really appreciate. Can you tell people where they can find you if they want to check out your podcast, if they want to check you out on social?
Yeah, I have the Voices of VR podcast, which you can find at voicesofvr.com. And then I'm on Twitter at KentBuy, where I tweet about VR mostly, and sometimes I do a big epic Twitter thread on UFOs and kind of track different stuff in the UFO community. So at KentBuy on Twitter.
Amazing. Yeah, thanks so much, Ken. We really appreciate your time today. And we've also got, make sure you follow Aaron Desario, Daniel Miller, and Carl Vibe on Twitter. You can also find Carl on his YouTube channel, Carl Vibe. Make sure you check him out there. Everybody's links are in the descriptions below. You can find Daniel, you can find Aaron, you can find Kristen, you can find Luis, you can find me, you can find Kent. So thank you guys so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your time. We're going to wrap up very quickly now as we're 17 minutes over, but great show.
Oh, you got two last-minute donations here. One from Bricktop.
Oh, look at you, Bricktop in the house, and Christopher. Kristen, say his last name.
Oh, Chevalier.
Chevalier.
Christopher
Chevalier,
Chevalier.
Luis.
Wait. What did this one say? You guys know Jack Sarfati?
You guys know Jack Sarfati. Maybe BS. He's a theoretical physicist who worked with Hal Puthoff. Real or not, he says he knows how Tic Tacs work. Yeah, I've actually seen him on. I've seen him on Twitter. But I have not been able to track him down. That's all I know.
And then Christopher Chevalier says, great show, everyone. Thank you for creating such an awesome content. Huge guests the rest of the week on UCR and TSL.
Indeed.
Thank you so much for the donation.
Make sure, if you haven't subscribed, click the button below. Make sure you click the bell so you know whenever we go live. Also, head on over to UCR. Make sure you subscribe over there. We've got an amazing series of guests this week, and you're not going to want to miss those. So, I think that's all I got. Oh, another one, Case for Infinity. Hey, remember Chaz!
Chaz.
How can we forget
Chaz?
Chaz?
Shaw, that was... I'm trying to think of was it terrible, or was it? It was full Tony Clifton, full Tony Clifton is what that was.
We'll see if the character develops. We'll see what happens.
Yeah,
Chaz is.
We'll see if the character develops. Please say no. Please say no. Oh my God, it's so funny.
Bricktop, I wish you guys would just riff a bit. This always ends too soon. Oh, that's so kind.
I know, but we got to leave you wanting more, Bricktop.
Gotta come back tomorrow. Come see us tomorrow.
Come see us tomorrow. We'll be here for another 2 full hours. Yeah, it'll be fun.
Kidding, you have lives. I love you. Thank you all. Bricktop in the house. Thank you so much. We appreciate you, and we appreciate all of you who are in the chat today who have contributed to this amazing conversation. The Extraordinary Kent Buy. Make sure you go check out his Voices of VR podcast. He is somebody in the chat earlier was like, I just Google searched everything I could find on Kent Buy, and he is the real fucking deal. So make sure you follow him on Voices of VR, and make sure you follow him over on Twitter. He's a great guy to have in your life.
All right. We'll see you guys tomorrow.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Peace.